in the United States of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, this topic, of course, is related to the work that I do, both my scholarship and activism. For the vast majority of my life, it seems, I have been doing work in some way related to prisons. And I'm one of those activists or scholar activists who've been thinking about prison issues in a large context for many decades. And as a matter of fact, I could probably narrate the story of my entire life using anti-prison activism as an anchor. Because I could tell you that before I was born, my mother was active in the campaign to free the Scottsboro Nine. And over 80 years after this case emerged, which of course led to the fraudulent convictions of 9 Black men on charges of having raped 2 white women, death sentences, and many, many long years in prison, finally, the Alabama legislature is poised to offer posthumous pardons to all 9 members of the Scottsboro Boys, almost a century later. Now, about a quarter of a century after the Scottsboro Boys, I guess a quarter of a century after I was born, I became active in many campaigns to free political prisoners, Huey Newton, Los Siete de la Raza, Nelson and Winnie Mandela, Lolita Lebron, and the case that in many ways reshaped my life, the case of the Soledad brothers, George Jackson, Frida Drongo, and John Clouchet, who were charged with killing a guard in 1970 inside Soledad prison. So I could tell you that I was fired from my first job at UCLA, first for being a communist, and then when that didn't work, I was fired for speaking out on behalf of political prisoners. And that was according to Ronald Reagan and the regents at that time, behavior unbecoming a professor. So, and then of course I could tell you how I myself was arrested and charged with 3 capital crimes and how I was freed by a massive international movement that stretched from Europe to Africa to Asia to South and North America, including here in Canada. But that's not the story I'm telling you this evening. I'm going to attempt to end with a larger story. And I want to begin with a series of surrounding the sesquicentennial of the Emancipation Proclamation in the United States. And of course, I should make the point that Canada was not unaffected by the Civil War in the US and by the strategy that was announced by Lincoln in 1863. As a matter of fact, Canada was implicated in both sides of the Civil War. Former slaves who had traveled to freedom to Canada via the Underground Railroad joined the Union forces after the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. But the government of Canada did not prevent Confederate forces from seeking refuge in Canada as well. And so while I will refer primarily to implications of that history for the contemporary United States, I'm also keeping in mind that unfortunately, Canada follows too often in the footsteps of its neighbor to the south. But for now, another point. The story of the end of U.S. slavery belongs not only to us here in North America, but to the world. As a matter of fact, Black Americans have been the beneficiaries of solidarity generated in all parts of the world. The anti-slavery abolitionist movements all over the world, sanctuary from slavery offered by Canada and many other countries. I mentioned the Scottsboro 9 campaign. That campaign became as well known as it did precisely because of the international solidarity that was generated in connection with the case. And then in the 1950s, there was this notorious kissing case in the state of North Carolina, where a young boy, a young Black boy who was about 6 years old, kissed a white girl with whom he had been playing. He was arrested on rape charges. And only because there was an international outcry were the charges eventually dropped. And of course, I've already referred to political prisoners, and I might mention my own case and the solidarity movements in places like Brazil and Vietnam and Sri Lanka and Senegal and the former Soviet Union and France and Germany, both East and West, and so forth and so on. And parenthetically, I might mention that today, Leonard Peltier, who is probably the longest held political prisoner in the country, is still behind bars. And you here in Canada have a relationship to that case. And then there's Mumia Abu-Jamal, and of course the Cuban Five. But perhaps we can talk about those cases during the question and answer period. But I'm primarily interested in the fact that people all over the world have been inspired by the Black freedom struggle to forge. They've been inspired to forge activist movements addressing a whole range of oppressive conditions in their own countries. There's a relationship of inspiration and mutuality between the historical South African freedom struggle and the historical Black American freedom struggle. Martin Luther King was inspired by Gandhi to engage in nonviolent campaigns against racism, and the Dalit of India have been inspired by the struggles of Black Americans. More recently, young Palestinians protested the segregation of buses and highways and got on buses knowing full well they would be arrested, that were reserved for settlers traveling from one settlement to another inside occupied Palestine on segregated highways. Do you know what they call themselves? Palestinian Freedom Riders. In the United States, I'll not speak about Canada. I'll do my critique and focus it on the U.S. You can draw the implications for Canada if you wish. Our collective relationship to history is seriously flawed. Faulkner once wrote, I think it was in Requiem for None, that the past is never dead. It's not even past. And so we live with the ghosts of slavery. And I would like to pose the question, why are we not vigorously celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation? It's very bizarre. It would seem that this would be one of the most important historical anniversaries to observe. Am I right? But I've seen very little. Obama wrote a proclamation on December 31st asking people to celebrate January 1st, but I think it only came out on December 31st, so most people didn't even get it because they were out partying on New Year's Eve. Of course, another anniversary will be coming up, the 150th anniversary of the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. And I'm wondering what will happen then. Maybe we'll get another film. Because it seems that that's all we got in connection with slavery. Well, I won't talk about maybe later. But I began with this discussion of the Emancipation Proclamation issued 150 years ago, which was not so much a question of the emancipation of people of African descent by a president of the U.S. It was more a military strategy than anything else. And if one actually looks at the text of the Emancipation Proclamation, one discovers that as much space is devoted to the exceptions, that is to say, as long as states remain within the Union, or as long as regions of states were loyal to the Union, they could keep their slaves. So slavery was all right as long as it remained within the Union. Now, if we examine the meaning of this historical moment, however, it seems to me that we're better able to understand both the failures and the successes of emancipation, the dialectics of emancipation. We live with the popular myth that Lincoln freed the slaves. Is that what they tell you here in Canada as well? Which continues to be perpetrated and perpetuated and perpetrated in popular culture, of course, even by the film Lincoln, which I'm sure you've seen. But Lincoln did not free the slaves. As a matter of fact, according to Eric Foner, who's written a wonderful book on Lincoln and slavery, quote, the Emancipation Proclamation is perhaps the most misunderstood of the documents that have shaped American history. Contrary to legend, Lincoln did not free the nearly 4 million slaves with a stroke of his pen. It had no bearing on slaves in the 4 border states, since they were not in rebellion. It also exempted certain parts of the Confederacy occupied by the Union. All told, it left perhaps 750,000 slaves in bondage. Moreover, popular narratives about the end of slavery erase the agency of Black people themselves. And I suppose we can say that if Lincoln did not really free the slaves, he was shrewd enough to recognize that the only hope of winning the Civil War resided in creating the opportunity for Black people to fight for their own freedom. And as a matter of fact, W.E.B. Du Bois, in the 4th chapter of Black Reconstruction, which is the one text about the history of the United States that everyone should read, that so few people have read, and everyone should read that. Chapter 4 is entitled The General Strike, because he uses the vocabulary of the labor movement to convey the consequences of the Emancipation Proclamation. So chapter 4 is called The General Strike, how the Civil War meant emancipation, and how the black worker, he doesn't say the slave, he says the black worker, won the war by a general strike which transferred his labor from the Confederate planter to the Northern invader, in whose army lines workers began to be organized as a new labor force. And so he argues that it was because of the withdrawal of labor from the slaveholders and the bestowal of that labor on the Union Army that the war itself was won. Frederick Douglass said in 1865 that the Civil War was begun, quote, in the interest of slavery on both sides. The South was fighting to take slavery out of the Union, and the North was fighting to keep it in the Union. The South fighting to get it beyond the limits of the United States Constitution, and the North fighting for the old guarantees, both despising the Negro, insulting the Negro. And it was what Du Bois called this army of striking labor that eventually produced the 200,000 soldiers, quote, whose evident ability to fight decided the war. And the soldiers were not only men, there were also women involved in that fight. As a matter of fact, we know Harriet Tubman as the conductor on the Underground Railroad who brought more people to freedom than any other. She was also a spy and had to fight for her military pension for many years later. Du Bois writes in Black Reconstruction about the fugitive slave who had own communities and then worked for the Union. And he points out that they did not hesitate to pay the taxes that were asked of them from the wages. And those taxes built hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to fast forward for a moment to the 60s, and I want to go back to that era. And I want to point out that the mid-20th century that we know as the Civil Rights Movement, right, were necessary, were only necessary because slavery had not been fully abolished. As a matter of fact, what we call the Civil Rights Movement, we should call the 20th century abolitionist movement. Because those struggles were about the effort to abolish the vestiges of slavery. If slavery had been abolished, there would have been no second-class citizenship. Black people would have enjoyed full and equal citizenship. But let's go back to the 1860s. And we discover that one of the most hidden eras of U.S. history is the period of radical Reconstruction. It's certainly the most radical period. There were Black elected officials. There was the development of public education. This is the theme of this series, public education, education for the public good. And what many people do not recognize is that in the course of passionately struggling for the right to public education in the aftermath of slavery, Black people actually established the terrain on which public education in the South was created. So many poor white people who later became vicious segregationists only had the right to education as a direct consequence of those struggles in the immediate aftermath of slavery. Of course, there was the creation of what we now know as historically Black colleges and universities. There was economic development. As a matter of fact, some of the most radical legislation was passed during that era. And not only legislation that affected former slaves, but legislation that, for example, affected all women. More progressive divorce laws were passed, laws that guaranteed to women the right to own property, thus challenging the old patriarchal structure of society. But we don't know very much about that. Certainly not in the US, but not here in Canada either, do we? And it is often assumed that Jim Crow segregation was a direct consequence of slavery. It was a kind of transference of slavery to the era that followed slavery. But that wasn't so much the case. As a matter of fact, it was an effort to destroy the radical accomplishments of that era that had implications not only for Black people, but for all people. And as a matter of fact, we see during that era the emergence of an approach to punishment, emergence of punishment strategies that help us to understand what is happening today under the impact of global capitalism and the disestablishment of welfare states everywhere. The Ku Klux Klan emerged. 1866 is generally the year that's given. But these repressive formations, along with the convict lease system, in order to manage Black bodies that were now free. And of course, the abolition of slavery would have meant, had abolition truly occurred, it would have meant far more than the negative abolition of slavery. It would have meant far more than simply getting rid of the chains. It would have meant the building of new institutions, and this is what the campaign during the years of radical Reconstruction was about. It was about building schools, about housing, about healthcare, about all of those institutions that would have been necessary in order to integrate former slaves into a thriving democracy. And this is why Du Bois talked about abolition democracy. Abolition by itself was not enough. And in order to prevent these institutions from emerging, and it wasn't just the slaveholders. As a matter of fact, it wasn't even primarily the slaveholders. It was the capitalists. It was the northern capitalists who are responsible for the creation of these new institutions of racism, Jim Crow. Now, let's fast forward from 1877, which is the year that's generally proposed as the end of radical Reconstruction, to the 1960s. We were confronting issues in the 1950s and the 1960s that should have been resolved in the 1860s. And then, so therefore we had the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and you know the names of some of the figures, right? Rosa Parks, everybody knows Rosa Parks. Maybe not everybody knows Claudette Colvin, who had been arrested for riding on a bus in Montgomery before that, or Joanne Robinson, who wrote the book, The Montgomery Bus Boycott, and the women who started it. The women have been largely erased, with the exception of perhaps Rosa Parks. But I always like to point out that the Montgomery Bus Boycott and the movement we call the Civil Rights Movement, which is probably better named the Black Freedom Movement, because it was about more than civil rights, actually. Sort of got stuck there with civil rights was part of it, but not there were also economic issues, economic rights that were at issue as well. But the women who are perhaps the ones who were most responsible for the success of that boycott were Black women maids and washerwomen and cooks, because these were the women who refused to ride the bus. Now, I pointed out that the movement was much larger, and there has been an ongoing attempt to fit that movement into a small frame, into the frame of civil rights. And I'm not suggesting that civil rights is not immensely important. It is, but freedom is more capacious than civil rights. And there were some of us who insisted that it was not simply a question of acquiring the formal rights to fully participate in society, but rather also it was about, and this goes back to slavery, the 40 acres and a mule that dropped out of the abolitionist agenda in the 19th century. And so education and healthcare and housing dropped out of the agenda of the so-called civil rights movement. And of course, there was the question of ending the police occupation of Black communities that organizations like the Black Panther Party raised. And it's so interesting. If you look at that 10-point program that was formulated in 1966, 100 years after the founding of the Ku Klux Klan in 1866, you see that program recapitulated abolitionist agendas, and it continues to resonate in the 21st century. It's interesting, isn't it, that the Black Panther Party doesn't get included in the U.S. national narratives of democracy. The civil rights movement is represented as the triumph of democracy, that which has allowed the U.S. to claim its status as the model democracy in the world, right? But the Black Panther Party kind of like falls away, right? It's on the margins, and if you look at that 10-point program, you'll see why. And of course, the racism that was attached to the institution of slavery is still, is perhaps more a force in the contemporary United States than it was during the period that gave rise to what we know as the Civil Rights Movement. And this may be a controversial statement, I don't know. But I am so angry about this discourse of a post-racial society. All you have to do is elect a Black president, and all of that historical racism, all of those institutions that are so entrenched with racism somehow fall away. That makes no sense at all. And as a matter of fact, after Obama was elected the first time, a prisoner said, well, there may be one black man in the White House, but that doesn't cancel out the million black men and women in the big house. And so when I speak about racism, I'm not only speaking about the racism that has taken up residency in the psyches of so many people, including black people and people of color. Nobody is immune to the ideological toxicity of racism. But I'm also talking about the racism that is lodged in the structures of our institutions. The fact that all we need to do is open our eyes, and we see that even as we celebrate the ascendancy of people of color to high places in our political and economic hierarchies, their positions cannot compensate for the fact that there are now more black men under the control of the criminal justice system than there were enslaved in 1850. This is what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow. But if you want to call it the new Jim Crow, we have to acknowledge that it is far more virulent, especially because of the reign of global capitalism. So many people at the bottom of the hierarchy have been relegated to oblivion. They are considered detritus. They're not even recognized in political discourse. And of course, this is a class strategy. The term poor is hardly ever used in the US. And Obama talks about the middle class. But whatever happened to the working class? And of course, well, people all over the world recognize the convergence of poverty as a result of the Katrina. You remember those images? But now Katrina has led to what Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism. So now New Orleans is being rebuilt, but it will not accommodate poor black people in numbers that even begin to match their pre-Katrina presence. So there's no poor people anymore. There are no working class people anymore. Scott Walker in Wisconsin, you remember the campaign against the public workers in Wisconsin tried to erase public workers. And so this means that the challenges of scholarship and activism are vast today. We have to fight for the right to recognize, to discursively acknowledge poor people and working class people. And then, of course, working class issues, if we move from the field of discourse to the issues that ought to be associated with the working class, they have to embrace far more than what are narrowly construed as labor issues. They have to embrace for example, reproductive rights, and what has narrowly been represented as women's issues. They have to embrace violence against women. They have to embrace a whole range of issues, including LGBTQ issues. And of course, we know that the immigrant rights movement is central to any struggle for democracy. In the US, in Canada, in Europe, in this post-colonial era, immigrant rights have emerged as one of the primary arenas of the struggle for democracy. And so we can say that what civil rights was to the 20th century, the civil rights of immigrants are to the 21st century. And so few of the really important issues that demand our attention have been subject to extensive public discussion. So if the working class has been excised from political discourse, so have serious discussions about education, the state of our schools, the continuing crisis of over-incarceration and over-punishment. The U.S. is a prison nation. Of course, there are approximately 2.5 million people behind bars. And that constitutes 25% of the world's incarcerated population. Now, it would be different if the population of the U.S. Approached that of China or India, but it doesn't. The U.S. has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the incarcerated population. And it's not only that people who no longer fit into the structure of contemporary society under the impact of global capitalism. It's not only that they are warehoused and thrown away into these technologically advanced prisons that have developed carceral technologies that are beyond anyone's imagination. But that this process has become profitable itself. So if they're in prison largely because they don't fit into a society that places profits before people, and as a matter of fact, the jobs that used to be available have been exported. The whole process of deindustrialization that occurred during the 80s, it's not coincidental that the very period of the rise of global capitalism and deindustrialization and structural adjustment and the dismantling of welfare states was the period of the rise of the institution of the prison, the rise of the prison industrial complex, as a matter of fact. And so it's not only that this industry, this punishment industry, has become immensely profitable. So profitable that the private prison corporations were responsible for writing the repressive anti-immigrant legislation in Arizona and Alabama because they see immigrant detention as the next most profitable field for them. I mean, it's crazy, isn't it? It's absolutely insane. And then this strategy and these institutions have been exported. They have been exported all over the world. So it's not only in the countries of the global north that you find these massive, oftentimes super maximum security prisons, but it's also in Africa, it's also in South America, and especially in that's my timer. Sorry. Sorry about that. So I just have a few more minutes, but let me say, especially in places that are in the process of producing surplus populations. In Colombia, for example, where people have been thrown off their land. Whole process of deterritorialization. People, Afro-descended people and indigenous people who've been thrown off their land. And in order to make way for these huge agribusiness firms to grow crops like sugarcane, so that we who live in the countries of the global north can purchase biofuel for our cars and feel good about not polluting the environment. And in the meantime, people lose their means of subsistence. The very people who were the guarantors of biological, what is it called? Multiplicity, diversity, exactly. Biodiversity of the land are thrown into slums, and prisons are now being built because they are destined to inhabit these places where surplus populations are sent. So you see, the U.S. is a prison nation. That's the point. To say, this is not even to talk about the importance of the prison as a venue of torture in the context of the so-called war on terror. Let me say, before I conclude, that in my opinion, what is most important about this era is a consciousness of interconnectedness of various struggles. We can no longer afford to simply focus on a single issue. And as a result of the work of academics, we've acquired, I would say, feminist academics. We've acquired such vocabularies as the vocabularies of intersectionality, right? Right? Well, I could actually do another lecture about the ways in which certain concepts and certain knowledges actually have their origin in struggles for social justice, but because they become canonized in the academy, and because we don't learn ways of linking communities and universities in our citational practices, those of us who engage in research, we do not know how to cite anything other than other books or other articles. And so there is a major backstory to intersectionality. But the point that I want to make, that wasn't actually the point. That was a parenthetical observation. The point that I want to make is that we need now to begin seriously thinking about the intersectionality of struggles. For example, I do a lot of work with the prison abolition movement. And we have recognized how important it is to look, for example, at women in prison. Even though women constitute a relatively small minority of prisoners all over the world, if you examine the conditions of women and the experiences of women as represented by themselves, you gain a knowledge of the ways in which different modes of violence are very much interconnected. And so, the feminist slogan, "the personal is political," acquires a much more complicated meaning. The intimate violence that women in prison have experienced is very much related to the state violence they experience when they go to prison. And so we can develop an analysis of state violence that has to take into consideration the fact that the bodies that are most consistently the targets of violence in the world are female bodies. They're women's bodies. Even though we think about violence as primarily a male phenomenon. And then we have to go further and say, okay, we're talking about male, female. We're using a binary, a notion of gender. Maybe we shouldn't be restricted to this notion of gender, which only allows male and female, as the prison system does. And so, we begin to think about gender nonconformity, various modes of transgender expression, and we realize how the very institution of the prison is a gendering institution, and it affects all of us in the sense that it lodges this binary notion of gender in our minds and in our emotions. So this is what I mean when I say we need to consider the intersectionality of struggles. And we need more than ever a feminist approach. A feminist approach. But let me end. I really have gone over time now. So I wanted to end by going back to this way in which freedom struggles of the past have been forced into these narrow frames, these small frames. And someone like Martin Luther King, who is the towering figure of what we call the Black radical tradition, he has been so edited that he fits into the version of democracy related to neoliberalism of contemporary global capitalism. And I mean, it's interesting, almost everybody in the world knows Martin Luther King, but most of what they know is that he had a dream, right? That's about all they know. And, I'm actually kind of tired of that dream. And I wanted to conclude.
That certainly sets a good positive tone. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm going to turn over to Kirsten, our new administrator, not formally actually introduced publicly since the retirement of our long-serving board administrator, Lois Moran, who is with us today, filling in voluntarily, helping out to conduct this meeting. Everything that I've seen so far has been actually quite outstanding work. So, Kirsten, I'm going to turn it to you and ask for any changes to the agenda.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. There are 41 new items added under the consent agenda, listed as items 4.4, CU through EI. All of these items are posted on our website as part of the addendum package.
Okay. No further changes. Did you want to mention the change between the eScribe numbering and the hard copy documents that we have before us? You did mention it was an anomaly there that you might want to identify off the top.
It was a little bit of a different situation this time around with an agenda so large, but essentially everything that is posted online matches up to all the hard copies that our board members and Hamilton Police Service staff have up until AB. After that, things switch up a little bit. So if there's any questions, if we make reference to any of those agenda items under 4.4 for the information of the board, please speak up and I'll do my best to explain any discrepancies.
Okay, and I'll do my best if they come up to just identify them by title so that there's no confusion. Thank you very much. Can I have a motion to approve the agenda that is amended? Moved by John, seconded by Chad. All in favor, show hands.
Mayor, if I may, I do have an added motion for today, so if we could have that.
Yeah, let's do that now. So are you going to do that in under new business?
I will.
Okay, all right. So let's added motion from Councillor Collins in the new business category. And as amended, I saw hands, so thank you for that. And we're going to turn right to item 2.1. And as we all well know, we had an independent review done by Scott Bergman of Bergman, Cooper, Sandler, Shime, and Bergman out of Toronto, and he is now going to present his report that we've all had in hand since Monday. I think, Scott, you can confirm that this report was delivered to everyone at the same time, media, public, board, staff, chief, and everyone else. So I'm going to turn it over to Scott Bergman for your presentation on the report. Scott?
Thank you, Chair Eisenberger. I can confirm that the report was simultaneously released to the public, to the media, and to the board all at the same time on Monday, right around noon. I'm very pleased to be able to attend today's board meeting and formally present my report to members of the board, the public, and the media. The timing for the release of the report is very opportune given we're in the middle of June, which is Pride Month. My report was the culmination of months of interviews with members of the public and the Hamilton Police Service. I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to members of Hamilton's Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ communities for taking the time to meet with me. The past number of months have been a truly humbling experience for me. I'd also like to thank the Hamilton Police Service, who throughout this review acted with professionalism. I was promptly provided with every document request I made, and every interview I asked to be done, officers or employees of the service were provided and made available to me. So thank you to the police services for that. This past Monday, I did simultaneously release the report to the board, the public, and the media. I know you've had an opportunity to review the report, including my key findings and my recommendations. So with that in mind, my presentation today is going to consist just of the most important elements in the report. The Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ communities are entitled to celebrate their sexual orientation, diversity, gender identity, and expression. They must be afforded full protection of the law in doing so. They're entitled to bias-free policing in their daily lives. The majority of Canadians understand this. Some do not, including homophobes, white supremacists, and organized agitators. These people spew hatred, vitriol, and derision. They're quick to rely on freedom of speech while intolerant of the constitutional freedoms and rights of a multicultural and diverse society. A democratic society must recognize that the expression of abhorrent views is a necessary price to pay for our freedoms. But there are limits, and there are enforceable limits. On June 15, 2019, homophobes, white supremacists, and organized agitators disrupted Hamilton Pride 2019. Their activities could reasonably have been anticipated by police, but they weren't. As a result, the police response was inadequate, both before, during, and after the event. This added to the distrust of police in some circles. Now, with every crisis does come opportunity. There's been a legacy of distrust of police among many, but not all, members of the Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ communities in Hamilton. This crisis provides an opportunity for lessons to be learned and for a new relationship to be forged between the Hamilton Police Service and the communities. I'm convinced there's a strong appetite on part of the police and the community members to do precisely that. It's not going to happen overnight, but this report is designed to provide a blueprint for renewal. The community and the police require no less. Now, with respect to some of the key findings, the HPS fell short in its planning and preparation for Pride 2019. The HPS didn't prepare an operational plan until 2 days before the event. They failed to properly identify and effectively consult with Pride organizers prior to and during the event. The preparation and coordination was, in my respectful view, wholly inadequate. As a result, the operational plan lacked details, important details, including a map of the park that outlined the permitted areas of the event and the location in the park where agitators were likely to arrive. The operational plan did not identify the fact that the attendance of agitators at the event was likely to cause a disturbance of the peace. The plan also failed to specify legal mechanisms such as relevant criminal code provisions and municipal bylaws that could be used to protect the event and its attendees from being disrupted and intimidated by agitators. The service's inadequate preparation for Pride 2019 resulted in a failure to protect the public and Pride attendees during the event. The 4 officers assigned to Pride 2019 had no prior communication with and no contact information for any of the Pride organizers. The officers at Pride didn't know where the permitted areas for the event were or where the agitators were likely to attend. And once the 4 officers arrived at the confrontation, they did respond appropriately to what was a chaotic and volatile situation. It wasn't safe to break up the confrontation without more resources. They did not directly witness any criminal conduct and had to wait for backup. Public comments from the chief of police and from the service after Pride 2019 demonstrated a lack of concern for the LGBTQIA+ communities. The responses failed to demonstrate an understanding of what community members had experienced at Pride 2019. 4 days after Pride 2019, the chief appeared on a local radio show and was asked about the police response to the violence that broke out. He said this: "We were not invited to the event. We were not asked to be at the event, and we remained on the perimeter. We have to respect the request, too. It's kind of a no-win situation when you're asked not to be there, and then when you're not there, how come you weren't there?" Now, the public messaging coming from the service after Pride 2019 was seen by community members as an abdication of the service's essential function to serve and protect. When asked, most community members felt that the sole message coming from the service after Pride was that organizers had not invited police to the event, but had they done so, the service would have intervened more quickly. This may not have been true and was not the chief's or the service's intended public messaging. In fact, the chief later apologized for those comments. However, it was the message that the community took away. Whether invited to participate in Pride or not, the service had an overriding obligation to police the event, protect the public, and maintain order throughout. The relationship between the service and the Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ communities is, quite frankly, damaged. The service is committed to and has taken steps to improve the relationship, but more must and need be done. The service is committed to do this difficult work. There are many Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ community members who want to work with this service to improve the relationship, but admittedly, there are many who also do not. With respect to some of the recommendations that I made in the report, and there are numerous, I'll just take you through a couple. The service should unequivocally apologize to the community for its inadequate planning, the absence of communication with Pride organizers, and for creating the impression that the police response to agitators would have been different had the service been formally invited to the event. For 2021, officers, including the LGBTQ liaison officer, should meet with Pride organizers to discuss public safety issues after the plan is drafted and before the event takes place. The operational plan must include far more information than it has in previous years, including the numerous legal tools available to prevent agitators from disrupting the event. On the day of the event, supervising officers should arrive at the park and contact organizers before it starts. They should be in constant communication with the organizers throughout the event. The service and the board should publicly acknowledge that building a relationship of mutual trust will take years and should publicly commit to that hard work which is necessary for it to happen. The Hamilton Police Service must develop and mandate more in-depth seminars and hands-on training for officers with respect to Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ issues. Officers should be required to work within the Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ communities in order to receive experiential training in conjunction with more traditional lecture-oriented sessions. Officers of all ranks should interact with the LGBTQIA+ community and its members on a more regular basis. All senior command officers should receive enhanced media training to ensure any media appearances are conducted with professionalism and appropriate messaging. The Hamilton Police Service should carefully consider undertaking a diversity audit or an organizational cultural review. It should issue a statement such as, quote, "The Hamilton Police Service is committed to protecting the public safety and ensuring that Pride 2021 is a success for everyone that attends to celebrate the diversity of Hamilton. HPS will work with Pride organizers to ensure a safe event where everyone is respected, regardless of whether the service is asked to participate in Pride or not. The board and or the Hamilton Police Service should institute a mechanism for external review and audit of these recommendations in my report and for grading compliance with those recommendations. The police service should be prepared to address how and in what manner it has responded to the recommendations 12 months and 24 months after the release of my report. Although significant tensions and distrust exist between the Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ communities and the service, there's still promise. Much can be done by the service that will help foster a stronger relationship with the communities in Hamilton. With effective, ongoing, and committed community outreach, along with revised public communications efforts and a demonstrated desire on the part of the HBS leadership to prevent hateful agitators from attending and interfering with Pride events, the relationship can make positive steps forward. This will undoubtedly take time. It requires a concerted effort on the part of all parties. But as a public institution, the onus rests first and foremost with the Hamilton Police Service. Change often comes as a result of difficult circumstances and very challenging events. My discussions with HPS leadership indicate a strong desire to engage in the work that's necessary to build trust with the Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ communities. The cooperation and transparency with which the service operated throughout this review must be emulated in its actions towards the Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ communities on a consistent basis moving forward. And just on one final note, what I'd like to say is to those who I met with and those who I haven't met with who are part of the Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ communities in Hamilton and outside of Hamilton, you matter. Your identities are important. And what happened on the day of the event, Pride 2019, where agitators arrived and they tried to deny your identities is not okay. It's not being recognized in any way, and it shouldn't be recognized in any way. You had a right to celebrate in a way that was safe, that was family-oriented. You tried to, and it was interrupted, and that's not acceptable. So with that, Mr. Mayor and Mr. Chair, I conclude my presentation and I hand over the report formally to the board.
Great, thank you very much. And before we can formally receive that, I'm going to ask the board or anyone if there are any questions on the report itself. Councillor Jackson, go ahead. Don't touch your microphone. We'll cover it. There we go.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Bergman, Solicitor External Counsel Bergman, thank you very much for your report. The 124 pages, I've read it through, and I just want to say, External Counsel, before I get to a few questions, Mr. Mayor, that when I heard that you had won the contract to do this investigation, this independent external investigation, Mr. Bergman, I had heard about your firm's reputation and the fact that I believe you were involved in the very tragic circumstances in Toronto to some degree over the MacArthur serial killing. So I just thought it added even greater authenticity with your experience and knowledge in Toronto over that very tragic matter involving the murder of the gay men. Mr. Bergman, I appreciate very much your 38 recommendations. Mr. Mayor, I want to zero in on 2 or 3 that are of great importance to me. Recommendation 22, Scott, on page 112 of your report. And as somebody who, along with this board, unanimously hired, after about a year's vacancy, the community relations coordinator, Jazz Dillon, a woman of color from India, recently, several months ago, I was intrigued by your recommendation 22 regarding our current new LGBTQ liaison officer, Detective Constable Rebecca Moran, and your recommendation it ought to be a full-time sergeant levels position. I honestly thought when she was introduced, I think a couple of meetings ago, Mr. Mayor, that this would be her full-time, but I guess through reading the report, my understanding is she could be easily divided between her normal constable roles, if called to a traffic matter, domestic, whatever it might be, versus doing this full-time. Mr. Mayor, through to Scott, please maybe just further elaborate on why you feel that's important.
Mr. Bergman?
Thank you very much, Mr. Jackson. I do think that's important. I think to have a full-time LGBTQ liaison officer position and somebody, it doesn't have to be a sergeant level position, although that's something that could be contemplated. What I do believe it has to be is a fully funded position and a full-time position, because efforts can be divided. And there are significant issues that need to be resolved within the Hamilton community. And to have someone on the one hand investigating with a full caseload and being a detective constable, and on the other hand, being the LGBTQ liaison officer, it gives an image potentially that this isn't something that the police service is taking as seriously as it could.
Okay, thank you very much for that reaffirmation, and for what my opinion's worth, Mr. Mayor, at this time, I would fully support that, similar to what we did again with Jazz Dillon's hiring as the full-time community relations coordinator as well. Mr. Bergman, recommendation 36 on page 117 of your report about the Hamilton Police Service. Mr. Mayor should carefully consider undertaking an organizational cultural review. Is that after we hopefully were to approve your 38 recommendations today? Could you please unfold for me exactly how you foresee that occurring down the road, Mr. Mayor, through you to Scott?
Yep, Scott.
Thank you. With respect to the cultural review, organizational cultural review, or diversity audit, the first, I should say, I wasn't suggesting that I would be the person to do such a review. No, I think there are accounting and other firms that do this kind of, for consulting firms that do this kind of work. And I know those kinds of reviews have been done in other police services across Canada, not universally so, but there are models for doing that. So that's what I was suggesting. And as the recommendation indicates, the suggestion is get a snapshot of where the police service is at currently, then figure out where it wants to go, and then assess where it is, 12 months after the fact.
Okay, Mr. Bergman, appreciate that explanation. Mr. Mayor, on page 118, your final recommendation, Scott, recommend 38, the board and or Hamilton Police Service should institute a mechanism for external review and audit of all these recommendations and grading of compliance. I'm just wondering, would there be any benefit to possibly having a community task force of the members of this diverse community that would be part and parcel of the board or Hamilton Police Service doing the mechanism for a review of the 38 recommendations? Or do you see that staying within the board's purview, or should possibly members of the community be part of a citizen task force, if you will? Mr. Mayor, through you, thoughts on that, Scott?
Thank you. It's an interesting question, and I confess that I hadn't turned my mind to whether it would be a community task force. As you know, there are recommendations with respect, and there are findings with respect to advisory, community advisory boards and task forces, and whether the time is right for that or not. I do think, as you bring it up, that if the community, or at least senior members of the community, or members who were, for example, leaders of different community organizations, are involved in that type of review, it will definitely add credibility in the community's eyes, as opposed to just the board or the service being seen to evaluate itself, which, as you know, some community members, or many community members, have skepticism about.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Mayor, your indulgence, please. I just think my questions are important, at least for my edification. I just got a couple more.
We're at questions, yeah.
Thank you. I immediately, when I got your report, your investigative summary and report, Mr. Bergman, I went to part 4 about the planning for the Pride 2019 event. And you've already spoken in some pretty stark and stern language about what you felt was woeful. I was even a little bit puzzled and surprised that members of the LGBTQ community were trying to send emails to the community relations coordinator, Sandra Wilson, who had since retired. The position was vacant and had not even had, if you will, a response based on the report you wrote. So I guess I'm asking that, saying I guess that was part and parcel of what you felt may have been just a hodgepodge of what didn't happen, could have happened, lack of happening, Mr. Mayor, through you, because I really focused in even on the fact that that position was vacant, and nobody had told the community it was vacant, at least based on your report. Mr. Mayor, through you, please.
Scott?
That's right, Mr. Jackson. The community was not aware. The organizers of Pride certainly weren't aware that Ms. Wilson had departed, and I don't take any issue with her departure or the fact that it took some time to find a suitable candidate to replace her. The issue was that the email kind of got lost in the ether, if you will, and that contributed to some of the concerns that the organizers and the communities had about it.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Mr. Mayor, last comment, and Scott, just to reaffirm, on page 4 of your summary, I'm going to read your paragraph, last paragraph. Change often comes as a result of difficult circumstances, challenging events, as you said. My discussions, this is you, with the Hamilton Police Service leadership indicate a strong desire to engage in the work necessary to build trust, etc., in doing your report. Mr. Mayor, through you.
I think you framed it exactly right, Mr. Jackson. I have to say that in dealing with the Hamilton Police Service and making document requests or trying to meet with individuals, whether it was the chief on down, universally, we had an overwhelmingly positive experience. It seemed to be completely transparent, and there was no impediments, no roadblocks, either by the board for that matter, or from the police in terms of doing our review. This was truly an independent report, and we had the assistance and cooperation of Chief Gert all the way through down. I should say that Superintendent Goods Ritchie was very instrumental in helping to set up the interviews and helping to coordinate and facilitate the exchange of information. So I should say that, and I know she's on this, she's joined this meeting, she's done a tremendous job, and she was invaluable in the way in which we were able to meet our deadlines, quite frankly. So thank you to her as well.
External Counsel Bergman, Mr. Mayor, I'm just glad our board unanimously last summer decided to go down this path. I have no regrets. And I'm pleased with the overall report and the 38 recommendations. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for your indulgence.
Okay, thank you. Further questions? Member Mandy?
In your report, there's a statement that there's a clear sentiment within the community that the board has not and does not hold the police services accountable with issues surrounding policing and the community. Can you expand on that a little bit? Was there any further discussion, and any advice for us as a board?
I think one of the things that came up from not all community members, there were select community members, felt that the board was a mechanism for just rubber stamping requests by the police, to be quite frank. And there were concerns by community members that police budgeting, for example, should be more carefully scrutinized, and harder questions should be asked by board members. That was some of the sentiment that we heard from some of the community members. Now, I didn't delve into whether that's in fact accurate, so I'm just repeating what I've heard from the community. It was outside, I think, the scope of this review to get into that, but that was some of the concerns that were raised by community members. And like I said, it wasn't all community members, it was some community members.
Thank you. Perception is important.
Thank you. Further questions, Pat?
At the moment.
No. Member Collins, Jed, go ahead.
Thanks, Mayor, and thanks, Mr. Bergman, for the very comprehensive review. And like others, I completely accept all of the recommendations that are contained in the report. I think what was most surprising was that we received one review that certainly came to a different conclusion, and then your investigation yielded something completely different. So the question that, after reading your report almost twice, that I had was how do you arrive at your conclusions, and how did we, through our own internal investigation, arrive at something completely different? When reading your report and looking at the original conclusions, and I thought, geez, how is the other report so drastically different than the one that you presented? And that's the problem that I'm having in terms of reconciling how two investigations can occur and there's two completely different conclusions, essentially.
Scott?
I think it's a fair comment, and I think it's quite frankly a comment that's been pointed out in some of the media coverage that's occurred since my report was released and the other one was made public. I think there are a couple of things. First of all, we didn't do the exact same kind of review. Mine was a more comprehensive review, and mine was looking at also adequacies of policies and procedures, where I think the internal review, and I don't want to speak for the internal reviewer, I think it was Sergeant Heron, but I think that review looked at whether police officers complied within the confines of policies that exist, whereas mine was a broader brush look at whether the adequacies of the policies were there. And so my review ultimately found not that officers who attended at the park, for example, did anything wrong, but that they were handicapped by poor planning and by policy gaps. So I think that's one of the ways in which you can look at the distinction between these two reports and say they're not completely contradictory, although in many ways mine delves, I think, a little bit deeper. And that's as a matter of just definition of what my mandate was and what the officer who did the review, what his mandate was.
Perfect. Thanks for that. Appreciate that, Scott.
You're welcome. Okay, thank you. Fred Bennick. Fred?
I just want to say thank you, Scott, for your work on this, at you and your staff. And I also want to acknowledge members of HPS as well as all of those that you interviewed who came forth and gave you a sense of, or you gave them a sense of confidence to be able to participate. And I guess on behalf of the board, we want to say thank you for that. My question really has to do with the OIPRD report that we received on Friday, I think it was, and your report on Monday. And again, just some confusion, and I appreciate your explanation around the details that you reviewed.
Okay, is that a question or just a statement?
No, that was just a statement. Okay. Basically the same question that Chad had asked.
Very good, thank you. Any other questions before I ask my question? And before we get to an agreed statement by the board, I think there was a unanimous statement that we'll be sharing that the board has agreed to share as well, and I'll read that in a moment. So, Scott, in the preamble, in terms of the two reports, and in your statement around they were hampered by poor planning, which I think we all will accept at this point that's been an issue, and clearly was an issue in this instance. But one of the accusations back then and still rolls around today is that police officers stood by while people got assaulted. Especially Pride people. That was one of the accusations that was leveled at all of us, quite frankly, back in the day. Did you analyze that? I mean, I think one of your comments in the report was that when the police did arrive, they virtually did everything right in terms of the current circumstance. They were hampered by poor planning and all the other things that challenged them, but they did things right when they got there and did the appropriate separation of the agitators and the defenders. But did you in any of your interviews get a sense that any police officer stood by and watched anyone get assaulted?
No, I didn't. In fact, during the course of our interviews, it became quite clear to us, and not only interviews, we reviewed police officer notes and other reports, and also dispatch from 911 call records. What we found was that because the planning was inadequate, officers didn't arrive to the scene until after the assaults had really taken place. And once they did arrive, they did everything they could, but it was a bit too late, quite frankly.
Right, fair. So on the accusation that officers kind of willfully stood back and watched people get assaulted, your answer to that is no.
My answer is no. I didn't see any facts to find that in any way officers viewed or witnessed assaults and let them happen. No.
Thank you. Any other further questions from anyone? If not, I'll take a motion. Don, is that a motion or you want to have a question?
Is it a question, Mr. Mayor?
Okay, go ahead, Don.
Not a question, but a confirmation. I just wanted to say to Mr. Bergman and to the board and to the staff that we're moving forward on this, and we appreciate the good work and what has been revealed, and we have some good things to improve upon. But with everyone's input, we appreciate it very, very much. So well done.
Okay, thank you, Don. So moved by yourself, seconded by Jordy Elms, that the report be accepted and received. All in favor on the board side? Thank you. Thank you very much. And Scott, if you'd hang in there for a moment, I'm sure there'll be some other workings. This is an agreed to statement by all of the board members unanimously. And it reads that on June the 8th, 2020, Scott Bergman of Cooper, Sandler, Shime, and Bergman LLP released his report, Pride in Hamilton, an independent review into the events surrounding Hamilton Pride 2019. And today, Mr. Bergman made a presentation of his findings directly to the Hamilton Police Services Board. The board at this time sincerely and unreservedly apologizes to the Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ communities for the events connected to Pride 2019 as they transpired. We accept criticism and feedback and will listen and learn from the Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ communities in Hamilton. The board thanks Mr. Bergman for his report and accepts his findings and recommendations. We commit to work with the Chief and Senior Command of the Hamilton Police Service to implement all 38 recommendations. The Hamilton Police Service has made efforts to improve its practices and procedures to support the Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ communities. However, we ask the HPS to provide to the board these updated practices and procedures, as well as an implementation plan on Mr. Bergman's 38 recommendations, and that these reports be brought back to the board at its September 2020 meeting. The board denounces all organizations, groups, or individuals that promote hate, violence, intolerance, discrimination, hate speech against anyone in our community. We will continue to promote inclusion and diversity and full respect for all people in our community, no matter who you love, no matter what faith you practice, no matter your skin color or where you come from. We sincerely pledge to do everything we can to ensure that the members of the Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ communities can continue on a safe and caring environment free from discrimination in any form and filled with equity, inclusion, and opportunity for all. And, I think it's an important statement to make, and I'm happy to make it on behalf of the board. Can we have a motion to approve that statement from the board? Moved by Dawn, seconded by Councillor Jackson. And all in favor of that statement, just to make sure that we're all in agreement on this. And that's unanimous. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Chief Gert at this point, who I believe will also is interested in some comments on this. Chief, go ahead. For some reason, we can't hear you. So something's amiss. So it doesn't look like that he's muted. Okay, do you want to hit your microphone button? Something's wrong or off there.
How about now?
Now you're on. There you go.
Okay.
Thank you.
I apologize for that. So thank you, Mayor and Chair, and also thank you to Mr. Bergman. Appreciate that. With every crisis, as noted by Mr. Bergman, comes opportunity, and this report marks a blueprint for the future of our service. It presented a candid and stark reflection of what took place last June. At the same time, this report was necessary. As Chief, I take full responsibility for what took place at Pride before, during, and after, and I do apologize to the community for inadequate planning and preparation for Hamilton Pride 2019. We can do better. We must do better. I'm also sorry for statements made during and after the event that created the impression our response would have been different had we been invited. Hamilton Police Service is committed to ensuring public safety where everyone is respected and protected, regardless of whether we asked or invited to participate. This is our job, to serve and protect. The lack of communication with Pride organizers before, during, and after the event was unacceptable. On reflection, any statements made during and after Pride that suggested There was moral equivalency between those who sought to spread hatred and those who were defending the celebrations were wrong. I acknowledge that our relationship with the Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ communities has been significantly damaged as a result of what took place at Pride 2019. We recognize it will take years to rebuild our relationship and earn your trust. I am committed to doing the hard work required to rebuild and restore that trust that has been broken. I will ensure our members receive education and training provided by those with lived experience to meet the expectations of our community. Many of the recommendations are focused on changing the culture of our organization. I will work with the community to make this change a reality. This is the only way forward. We will dedicate the necessary time and resources to realize the vision set out in this report. That journey begins today. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you very much, Chief, for your comments, and you're releasing that formal statement, I'm assuming?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. One last item on this then, before we thank Scott for all of his work and allow him to get to, I'm sure, other work that he may want to do, and that is a formal motion for a direction to the board. It's going to be moved by myself, seconded by Vice Chair Don McVicker, that whereas the Hamilton Police Service Board is in receipt of a report from Scott Bergman of Cooper, Sandler, Shime, Bergman, LLP, entitled Pride in Hamilton, an independent review into the events surrounding Hamilton Pride 2019. Therefore, be it resolved, A, that Hamilton Police Services staff be asked to provide the board with updated HPS practices and procedures concerning the Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ communities. B, that Hamilton Police Services staff be asked to provide an implementation plan on Mr. Bergman's 38 recommendations. And C, that these reports be brought back to the board at its September 2020 meeting. And it's moved by myself, seconded by Vice Chair Don McVicker. Any comments and questions on it? Mandy?
I have a few comments. One, I agree in principle with the direction that you're saying, but I think we really need to listen to the report that talks about and the recommendations that there be some external participation in that review, the recommendations that come from us, so that it is arm's length. I also believe that all of the recommendations need to be done. There needs to be some collaboration with the community so that there is involvement and that there is buy-in as we go, as it goes along. One of the things that I didn't hear, and we need to be sensitive to, was really around the power difference relationships. And I think that that's a really difficult piece that we need to think about in trying to engage and develop relationships. And so while we recognize that it may be slow coming, it will take a long time, but developing those relationships will be key to even to be able to move forward with the recommendations. The only thing that I was thinking, I wonder, since a lot of work has already been done on what the current practice is and what's been implemented, whether we could have that in our July meeting and then have the recommendation implementation plan at September. I also think that we've heard a lot about, not a lot, but we've heard some that the board needs to be taking more responsibility and involvement. And I think that the board needs to have input into the implementation plan as well.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments? Okay, the motion's before you, moved and seconded by myself and Don McVicker. All in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none, thank you very much. Mr. Bergman, thank you for your good work and getting us to this place, and we look forward to kind of working with the community to improve relationships and improve the Pride event into the future, and continue all of that important good work under the guidance of the 38 recommendations you've made. So we thank you very much for your time and effort, and we look forward to seeing you again at some point. Hopefully not for an independent investigation, I would add.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all members of the board and to the Hamilton community, the chief and Hamilton Police Services, and especially to the Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ members in the community. Thank you.
let me mirror that. Thank you. This has been a difficult scenario for one and all, especially for the LGBTQIA plus community, and we thank them for their participation, and we encourage them to actively participate in the work that needs to be done going forward. It's going to require people of goodwill coming together to look for a better path into the future. And so we anticipate that that will happen. Thank you, Scott, for your work, and we look forward to next steps. I'm going to turn it over to Chief Gert for an update on COVID-19. Obviously, a top of mind issue for everyone today as well. So, Chief Gert, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mayor and Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good. So really at a very broad range, and I will get into some particulars both for financial impact and operational impact, and I'll do it in that order. We have been adapting, like all agencies, to ensure that we have the proper protective equipment for our members that safeguard not only them, but members of the public. And that has been the focal point, and ensuring in terms of practices and changes that we move swiftly. Certainly from a court perspective, and you can see by, I think it's the 76 all chief memos in your package, they have been working quite industriously through the Solicitor General and Attorney General to make substantial changes during this difficult pandemic. So I'm going to turn it over first for COVID costs over to our CEO, Anna Felice. I will mute myself, and over to you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chief, and through the chair. So as at May 31st, in terms of COVID-related costs, the service is sitting at an additional $332,000. That does not include invoices that we know are coming, but just haven't hit our books yet. If we project out to December, we anticipate spending up to $724,000 in COVID-related expenditures. And I'll just, in a very high level, break that down. About $400,000 of that is our hard costs due to additional cleaning, additional PPE, disinfecting services, and smaller amounts for some barriers and some equipment to enable some remote access, just to help our staff working from home. Another $125,000, or actually a little bit more than that, another $300,000 is employee-related costs. So we had some absences that were COVID-related, so those aren't necessarily direct costs, but folks that we continue to pay, but that were at home either due to self-isolation or what have you. We had about $125,000 in training costs that was directly related to the class that we just had to send to OPC. Because of the tight timelines, we were forced to do 6-day training weeks instead of 5, which resulted in overtime for that. And then we do have some impacts from lost revenue, mostly due to police clearances and police checks that we're just unable to do. In terms of cost avoidance, there have been some delays, which I'll speak to on the next agenda item, to moving into the new ISD building. While that's unfortunate, we are saving and delaying the operating costs for that building. So as of right now, we've saved about $100,000. And if we go a few more months, that might double to about $200,000. And finally, we did put pause on most recruitment, especially for civilians. We moved forward with our sworn intake to keep up with the OPC dates, but we've got gapping in the neighborhood of about $244,000 for positions that we delayed filling, which we're starting to move forward on now. So in total, just to recap, we're at about $332,000 as at May 31st, but we're projecting by the end of the year $724,000.
Okay, thank you. Chief, back to you. Any additional updates beyond that?
Just a quick one on the operational impact. So as you know, Deputy Chief Diodati from the outset has been connected to the EOC Center with the city, and of course, often that's virtual. But we have been running what is called a POC, Police Emergency Operations Center, here in the building. And sometimes it's virtual, but there is, as I say, all chiefs bulletins arriving every day that we then have to operationalize. So I will turn it over to the deputy for the impact. Thank you, Daddy.
Deputy, welcome. You want to unmute them? Go ahead.
Can you hear me, Mr. Chair?
Yep, we're good.
Thank you. Thank you. I first just want to recognize the members who make up the IMS structure, the Incident Management System structure, and the PIOC, who've been working tirelessly to adapt to the daily challenges that COVID have presented, just ensure that our members are continuing to stay safe and continue to provide exemplary service to our community. And I'd like to recognize specifically the Incident Commander, Inspector Sean Blay, the Operations Chief, Superintendent Greg Huss, the Planning Chief, Ian Snedden, the Finance Chief, Sanella Roche, and the Logistics Chief, Doris Chardulu. The IMS team is supported by Legal Counsel Marco Vizentini and our Communications Chief, Jackie Penman, as well as Officers Meg Ryan and Sergeant Fab Giuliani and Rebecca Bailey. They have been great contributors. This has truly been a team effort, in each division contributing and stepping up to provide assistance. I'm extremely proud of all our members, both civilian and sworn, for the work that they continue to do through this pandemic. For just some of the highlights, as the chief mentioned, we've worked through 46 all-chief memos specific to the pandemic. We've provided 42 updates to our members. We've created a mailbox specifically for our members, so if they had any concerns for information sharing, they did have access to a mailbox 24/7 that they could, again, reach into the PIOC and we would address those concerns very quickly. We came up with a pandemic action plan and a pandemic operational plan within 2 days of the state of emergency being declared. We've worked through a number of different process challenges, and again, I'll just go very quickly through the highlights of a health and safety strategy, a new sudden death investigation, a civilian and sworn staffing plan. We had a DNA order and fingerprint protocol changed. We were asked to enforce the Quarantine Act. Again, we managed through the pandemic, after the state of emergency, within 2 days, we were able to stand up a very robust operational plan specific to COVID. We restricted all access to our police facilities and installed communication intercoms for members of our community who still attended our station. A comprehensive health and safety plan, again, specific to COVID, was implemented in the month of March. We moved through April. Again, we had DNA orders that we had to work through. We assisted the EOC with the mass fatality plan, and we continued to work with the MCPA with our partners, with municipal law enforcement and bylaw, and enforcing those. And we also had to work on enhancing technology for e-warrants and informations. And May brought us to reintegration recovery plans. So we're currently working through those. We have a workspace assessment team beginning reviews in each division. We're ongoing with temporary measures to accommodate closing of courts and the releasing of prisoners. And most recently, we were just advised that the Ontario Police College will be holding their promotional exam in June, later on this month. So we're currently working to ensure that our members are provided a safe space to be able to write that exam. So those are just some of the highlights that we've been able to accomplish over the last 3 months.
Great, thank you. And still in operation, Ryan? You still got your emergency center operating?
Yes, sir. It's still operating, as the chief mentioned. On some days it's virtual, but when required, we go in person.
Okay, thank you. Chief, back to you for any final comments.
Like the most of the other organizations, we're looking what happens both at the provincial and federal level. I know that you have been very industrious in this area. We are aligned both with public health recommendations and the Emergency Operations Center under Director Paul Johnson and yourself as oversight for that group. So we do align with your recommendations, public health recommendations, and look forward to a time when it's a little more normal.
Yes, yeah. Better days are ahead, that's for sure. Any comments on the COVID-19 report? Okay, I saw Councillor Jackson, then Councillor Collins. Councillor Jackson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Chief, thanks for the update. And Deputy Diodati. Chief, just a question. I think about a month or so ago, there was one member of the service that tested positive. I believe that member has since cleared, if I recall, in updates from you and the service. Just wondering overall, Mr. Mayor, the morale of the 1,100 plus members, both uniform and civilian, and in terms of how they're managing through the 3+ months of COVID, and hopefully that there's been no other testing of positive. Mr. Mayor, through just for general feedback from the chief, please, on the morale.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you, Mayor, and back through you. And I don't want to jinx it, we've had one exposure to date, and that member is fine, as you said, and back at work. We do take precautionary measures, both with isolation, the testing. As you know, the province and public health locally have expedited that for frontline responders, so we really appreciate that. In terms of the morale, and I think you've seen it, Councillor, in your own area where we're seeing speeding, stunt driving, break and enters were on an increase, and we have dedicated both resources and specific plans to those emerging trends. Our officers are continuing to make arrests. They're continuing to do all the daily work that they do, including, and we know that mental health, I know through the mayor, is gone up with this anxiety as a more general principle, and just the change in the culture for everybody. So it has been stressful for very many people. So we continue to respond to those calls. I will mention that our MCERT, unlike other jurisdictions, does in fact have a mental health nurse that responds with an officer to a case that is both life-threatening, either that person themselves or a member of the public. And I think we're one of the few jurisdictions that does that. It's certainly been recommended of late. We're already doing that. We really do rely on those with the skill set, both for de-escalation and proper response to mental health issues. So yes, in my view, the membership is carrying on. They're quite industrious, they're engaged. They wear PPE when required, but not 24/7. And I think that's probably positive, because if you're wearing a mask all the time, people can't really see your true emotions on your face. So that's an important measure, but where we've got exposure, we will in fact use that, up to including a half mask respirator, the N95 mask, or in many cases, just a surgical mask. So thank you for the question. I know our members appreciate concern about their well-being.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Chief. You've raised my comfort level. I'm deeply, deeply grateful for their frontline service, even more so during the pandemic plague time, and very appreciative of their call to duty and what I've seen as coming right to the fore. If anything, in terms of absenteeism or anything, I haven't heard a single word of that. I've just heard the call to duty has been even stronger over the last 3 months. Appreciate it, Chief. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Service has absolutely rallied, for sure. I think that's pretty self-evident. Councillor Collins.
Thanks, Mayor. And, we have our year-end operating surplus that's in a different report today, 44J, and that highlights a 1.4 million operating budget. So I'm asking in the context of that surplus, and then Anna certainly highlighted the fact that we're, trending towards a $700,000 plus year-end deficit. The last time I was on the board, I worked with our finance staff here at Hamilton Police Service, as well as Hamilton's finance department, to create a policy as to how police variances would be treated at year end. And I think of all years, this may be one of those historically now, and the policy, as I understand it, is that those year end variances are put into a reserve, and Hamilton Police Service uses them for capital purposes. I think this may be one of the years where we want to check in with city finance staff to talk about, how we deal with our own negative year-end balance, and then corporately, as you know, and was referenced just now, Mr. Mayor, we're looking at a $60 million plus deficit at the city, and I don't know how HPS plays a part in offsetting those costs in whole or in part. So I don't want to get ahead of ourselves in terms of the report that's coming, but one report has year-end variance, it's surplus. This one, we're talking about a deficit. And I think of all the years, this is one of those years where we should huddle with finance, because I don't anticipate at the end of the year that the province and or the federal government will have the capacity to assist the city with its deficit in its entirety, or in our case here, with the smaller number that's referenced in the report. So I say that as it relates to, I think there should be some direction for our staff to meet with city finance staff to determine how HPS plays a role in these very, under unique circumstances and under very trying and difficult times, to deal with some of these budget pressures that we hadn't anticipated at the beginning of the year.
Anna, did you want to, I know there's been ongoing dialogue with Mike Segerick at the city finance manager. So Anna, do you have any thoughts on that ongoing dialogue?
Yes, thank you through you, Chair. Well, through the surplus report, which is, I believe, 4.4J, you'll see some of the items. Some of that was directed by the board through the budget process. Typically, we do put any excess surplus that we're not asking to be allocated to items into the reserve for other capital projects or other issues that might arise. But in terms of the surplus that is there, of the 1.4 million, you'll see in the report, $500,000 of that was allocated for the review that we just talked about, and about 300,000 for police vehicles, which we deferred putting into the budget to eliminate 2020 budget pressures, but we knew we had to put that back in. And that accounts for a large portion of that 1.4 million. At the end of the day, we'll take direction from the board. We do have conversations with Mike Zagaric, Brian McMullen and their team sometimes daily about how to manage some of these budget pressures, and happy to do so moving forward as well.
That's great. I think that's important. So glad to hear that's already occurring, and I think we need to be part of the solution as much as possible by year end, and hopefully the numbers trend in a different direction between now and the end of the year. And again, under these unique circumstances, normally we'd say this is all going to capital, whatever's remaining, as Anna has pointed out. But this year, I think more than others, we need to huddle with city finance staff to determine how we might assist. That's all. So if it could be reported back to us at a later date, I'd very much appreciate it.
Great, thank you. On COVID update then, any other questions on it? If not, it's just a verbal update, so no need to move anything. On the second one is a new verbal update as well. New investigative services building. We're marching forward, and Anna, police, can you give us an update as to where we're at? Maybe move-in date and some of the things that are still left undone.
Absolutely, Mr. Chair. So we had originally communicated moving into the building beginning in May, but due to COVID, a lot of our vendors and contractors closed their doors for a number of months, which did delay the project. Having said that, we are still on budget with the building, and it is moving forward. Recently, things started to move forward a little more quickly, which was encouraging. At this point, pending a few things that might hold us back, but we're still hopeful that the building will be turned over to us likely mid to late July, and then we'll have to do a bit of work before our staff start moving in. Our move-in will take several weeks, but we're anticipating an initial move-in date of August 13th. So our first wave of ISD staff will start moving in on August 13th, assuming that we don't hit any snags. So, for example, we're waiting for the delivery of certain materials for the building, our reception counter, our alarm verification, things like that. We're hoping they come in on time, but those are things that might hold us up. But right now, we're optimistic that August 13th we'll start moving staff in, and we should have everyone in if that starts sometime in September.
Okay, thank you. Any comments or questions on the moving forward on the investigative services building? Seeing none, thank you then. So we're going to turn to any declarations of interest. Not hearing of that either, so not seeing any indication. So we're going to go to consent agenda. Can we have a motion to approve the consent agenda, which includes now 44CU through to 44EI? Any comments or questions on the consent? I see Don indicating a move to approve. Correct? Okay. And anyone else second it? Thank you, Gordy. Thank you very much, Jordy. Any comments or questions on any of those items? Approval of the consent items, adoption of the minutes, March 12th. Obviously, the correspondence electronic report from Scott Bergman, and then we head into the communications item. So a motion on. Okay, Don. All right. Sorry. Did see you there, Don. Go ahead.
That's okay, Mr. Chair. I just have a question on 4.4F. On the youth services for the chief. On page 299 under the executive summary, it was noted that we went from, in 2018, 500 youths were involved in violent crimes versus 445 in 2019. So there was a significant improvement. If you could just elaborate on any reason for that, or just to give? Was it education? Was it new interaction with the youth in that regard? Chief,
go ahead.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. What I'd refer you to is actually the front page of that report, the year-end report, Youth Crime. And I do want to highlight what those decreases have been. Our overall decrease for youth involvement in crime is 16.8% reduction. National decrease is 11%. But probably more interesting is we've got a 12.4% reduction in violent crimes from 2019 to 2018. Property crime has decreased 21.4%. And then youth involved in drug offenses has decreased by 34.5%. In answer to your earlier question about what is contributing to that, it's a combination of all of those things. It's a combination of the preventative programs, the education that we do both within the schools and elsewhere, the use of pre-charge diversion, because we do not see a high rate of recidivism. In other words, kids coming back to commit criminal acts. You've got the work of all the front line to work on what we call our strategic targeted offender program, where we have youth involved in high-risk activity who are released on conditions, and we ensure that they abide by those conditions. And sometimes that means just checking, not multiple times, but maybe once a night. Is the youth inside? Are they abiding by their conditions? So really, it goes back to our strategic approach to youth crime. We are tending to buck the trend from the Canadian context, but also we know that relative to the percentage of youth in the population, we're seeing more dramatic decreases. So over the, I'll call it the 15 to 20 year trend, that's what we're seeing is that implementing those measures way back when and the systems in place are helping us manage this issue.
Thank you, Chief. And Mr. Mayor, I just have a second question on the next item, 4.4G, on page 312, under the motor vehicle collisions. I'm just curious on the citizen reporting. In 2013, there was 6,034 reports, and now 2019, there's 8,807. Is there a reason for the increased reporting? Is that because of social media or new electronics, or just to expand on that question? Thank you.
Chief. Thank you, and through you again, Mayor. Not to belittle the citizen reports, but I think if you look at the category above it, where you look at personal injury accidents, it's actually been decreased from 1,300 to 1,200. What we've seen is an increasing number of motor vehicles on the road. And in fact, we used to include that as a number, but it became quite cumbersome for the report. But we do know the number of licensed vehicles and people using motor vehicles has increased substantially. That, of course, will lead to more accidents. In terms of the personal injury accidents, that's where people receive harm. So it's a combination, again, of engineering in the motor vehicle, our speeding and enforcement of aggressive driving. And lastly, you can see on page 5 of the 7, our support services and the initiative specifically on Red Hill enforcement. Again, this doesn't capture all the enforcement of the city, but this does capture enforcement relative to that specific area. And I guess what's probably concerning the most is the total stunting driving, which is 76 charges in that time span. But we also did ride lanes and a number of other things. So it really is a concerted effort around traffic safety between education, enforcement, and engineering initiatives to decrease the number of injuries and fatalities.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Member Manby?
Do my small, I'm having trouble finding where I wanted to get to, but just a small point. In the last minutes, I was absent, but it was with regrets.
Okay.
I don't want you to think I just didn't show up.
I'm glad you regret not being there. Thank you. Well, duly noted. Anything else on that? So you're off now for whatever reason. I'm just checking, Pat. I don't think she was finished. I'll double check. Sorry, Pat. You're on now. Were you finished? I'm sorry.
I'll come back later.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Fred Bennett?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had some comments regarding 4.4 S through X, the correspondence of some of the emails that we've received regarding defunding. Would you like those comments under the new business, or would you like me to share those now?
Well, I think there's going to be a motion relative to that, so probably a good time then to delve into that issue. We don't need to do it twice, I don't think. But so if you want to reserve those comments till then and refer to the comments in this correspondence, that'd be good.
I agree. Just wanted your permission.
Yeah, thank you. Pat, I can come back to you. I see no one else.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to ask about and I'm trying to find the number early on, the discrepancy in the two reports. So we had the internal report that went to OIRPD, and so I just wonder if there's any comments from staff about the difference, or we did hear from Mr. Bergman.
And thank you for the question. And as you know, when Mr. Bergman pointed it out, both reports had different mandates in terms of reference. One, the OIPRD is an investigative report that requires both corroboration, checking out facts to see if they're substantiated, supported by other people's version. And you'll see if you read the report, of course, it reads that way. The other was, in fact, a systemic review. Mr. Bergman, actually, on page 14, delineates what the nature of review. It's one paragraph. I'll just read it quickly. This is a systemic review. It was designed to identify systemic issues and make recommendations for change. It was not designed to make findings of misconduct or civil or criminal responsibility, and I'm quoting him, nor am I permitted in law to do so. So that's Mr. Bergman's, not my voice. I have made some findings relevant to my recommendations. Although some facts remain in dispute, I found that it was unnecessary to resolve the disputed evidence to identify which issues exist and how they should be addressed. And again, just for clarity, I'm quoting from the first paragraph on page 14. So I think they are different reports and they have different outcomes. And of course, we've already stated it. We welcome both the review and the findings.
Thank you. Betty?
Just to follow up to that. So when we get a report, anyone from after there's been a review by the OIRPD, is there an internal review to look at lessons learned and where do we go from here?
Chief?
Thank you for the question. And it depends on what the nature of the complaint was. As you know, when we have a service-related complaint, in fact, we had 3 in this case, that report is in fact forwarded to the board for review with exactly as you say. When it involves conduct investigations, and you'll be aware of this as well, the OIPRD may in fact direct a hearing. It may send it back to the service for review and findings, and you can either proceed to discipline without a hearing, or you could have a discipline where a hearing is called. So that is subject to both the OIPRD and myself, depending on the severity of what has happened. The last, I'll call it, permutation, so to speak, is I generate internal complaints if I view misconduct, which may or may not be generated externally. Conduct complaints generated externally are in fact handled by the OIPRD. They make the determination whether they will do the investigation or whether they send it back to the service for investigation. In this particular case, in all cases, with service complaints, according to the Act, they must be directed back to the chief for review and reporting to the board. As you know, in the case with the OIPRD investigation in this case, this board actually asked the OIPRD to have carriage of that investigation. They chose not to, based on the availability of their personnel, and directed it back to me, the chief, for investigation, which is their prerogative. And then, of course, the board has oversight once that complaint is completed. So I hope that answers your question. It's not, in fact, one stream or a simple answer, but it is the OIPRD that has oversight in most cases.
Thank you. I have one other question, and it's around B for the Durham report, the the divisional court report. I'm just trying to clarify. So it sounds like at present there's an administrator appointed to oversee the board and the chief.
Jerome? Yeah, I don't know if it's, sorry, I don't know if it's B in my appendix, but I am aware of what the report is. Is Member Mandy looking for what it's talking about?
Yeah, no, I just the result of all of that. So there's the decision is I was just trying to clarify when I read it. It says there's an appointment of administrator. That role, is it like a supervisor over the board and chief? Is that what that role is?
That's correct. And in fact, the chief of Durham contested that issue. OCPC has the prerogative to institute a person to oversee. My understanding, it's actually oversight of the police chief. I just turned to Marco to say if it does include the board or not. My understanding was the chief.
This is for Durham now, right?
Correct.
Yes.
Right. Marco, did you want to add anything? We're looking to unmute you. I think I just heard you. Nope.
Comments.
Marco, whatever you might have said, you have to start again.
Okay, I'll speak for him because he's sitting across from me.
No, he's not. I think we had him. We had him. What? We don't have him? We have him. We have him. Don't press any buttons. We'll press the buttons from here.
Okay.
Okay. You're on.
You have me. I that was a long kind of route for me to say that I really don't have anything to add to what the chief said.
Okay, good. Back to you, Chief.
Thank you. So, and I think I'm on.
Sure.
Yeah, that's in fact what happened, and it relates to Durham specifically, and the chief, I believe, challenging that authority for the OCPC, which was upheld by the courts.
Okay, Pat?
Thank you. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Member Jackson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Are you taking questions under any of the information items, 4.4?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. I've got 4 quickly, Mr. Mayor. 4.4 quadruple A. It's regarding Government of Canada ban on assault-style firearms. And the Minister of the Solicitor General's writing, Government of Canada announced the ban of over 1,500 models, variants of assault-style firearms under the Criminal Code of Canada. What I'm wondering, Chief, in the past, I think maybe on an annual basis, if memory serves me right, this service has provided an amnesty program for anyone who wants to bring in their firearms. In light of the Government of Canada's announcement, any thought of possibly doing that to get ahead of things and get these awful assault-style firearms out of our community? Mr. Mayor, through you, please.
Chief?
Thank you. And as you know, I believe it was Deputy Leenders that first instituted this. We do have a standing practice for amnesty. We do, in fact, highlight at certain points in the continuum to say, all right, let's emphasize again. But for the purpose of this public meeting, that amnesty remains open at any time. One of the key pieces we would say to anybody who is contemplating turning those firearms in to contact us. We will come out to your address, particularly where there are prohibited weapons. We've had things like grenades, Tommy guns, antique firearms, handguns, and in sometimes cases explosives. So for everybody's safety, please contact us. We will come out with people properly trained to render those things safe and turn them in. So that amnesty does remain on an ongoing basis, unlike many other jurisdictions. But we do, in fact, highlight every so often. What we find is if you do it, say, every 2 or 3 months, it begins to lose its impact. So we do regularly revisit that and can do so again. But it does, it's a standing amnesty.
That's great to hear, Chief. Thank you I commend you for the fact that it's an open-ended program. That's great. Mr. Mayor, further 4.4 quadruple I, religious gatherings and enforcement considerations. Obviously a very delicate situation. I'm just curious how Chief Gerd and Hamilton Police Service would handle this, Mr. Mayor. So many of our multi-religious communities, desperately are wanting to congregate, get together under provincial regulations. If I interpret it correctly, they can congregate in their cars, families only in that particular car, in the parking lot of that particular church, temple, mosque, whatever. But I'm just curious as to, this obviously comes under the Solicitor General and Chief. Obviously, I think they mentioned here on page 3, a kind of a go slow, sensitive, thoughtful approach. Just wondering if you've had any experiences during COVID, how your officers are handling this as delicately as possible. Through you, Mr. Mayor, please.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. As you know, bylaw is actually the first point of contact for these type of complaints under the EMPCA, and they, I believe, take a similar approach that we do, which is education first. If we go to the event and have, in fact, educated members of the congregation, mosque, samaj, whatever the particular religious function is, we will take that approach and have taken that approach. The other thing I would caution is that even if you look in these directives here, it has changed through the course of time. I suspect, and it is in fact the province that issues these, even though they come out through our ministry, but it's being handled at the Premier's level, what they will or won't allow. So I would just say, please check if you're contemplating as a member of the public that you're current. So I believe we have at least 2 or 3 within this package today, how things have changed through the course of time. And of course, now that they've moved to stage 2, other than our community, there are changes in that as well. So we all want to get back to the, as I said earlier, the normalcy as much as we can. But to your point, people don't want to breach it, but we would do take an education approach, and bylaw is the leading agency to deal with it in the first instance.
Thank you. Thank you, Chief. Like that approach very much. A couple more, Mr. Mayor, quickly. 4.4, quadruple M, e-scooters. I must say I was scared to death, Chief, driving down the Sherman Cut recently, and an e-scooter was going downbound on that narrow Sherman Cut that only has 1 lane upbound, 1 lane downbound. And of course, I carefully drove around it when I could safely, kind of straddling the middle line. I don't see a lot of them, though. Just wondering how we're handling that from a service standpoint, the fact that now they're legal to use our roadways. Through you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair, and back through you. This memo actually concerns capturing motor vehicle collisions and the requirements for reporting of that, and what is done and what is not done, coding and the body style and what an e-scooter is, and so on and so forth. But to your broader point, I think what those who are using the equipment have to know is what's the maximum speed you can attain. There is, in fact, a provision under the Highway Traffic Act for unnecessary slow driving. So were you to occupy a complete lane and be going, 12 kilometers per hour, you can, in fact, not do that. That's not relative to this particular memorandum, but in terms of provisions. And let's face it, you wouldn't be very safe on a scooter were you to be impacted. So much like a bicycle or other things like that, I think for the users, they have to be safety conscious about, what the limitations of the equipment are. Should you wipe out? I don't want to be into the path of an oncoming vehicle or one behind me. So just need to be very cautious about how you use that equipment.
Thanks, Chief. And Mr. Mayor, lastly, on the outstanding items, 4.4, quadruple T's. Mr. Mayor, as you know, a number of the correspondences we've had today have been about funding, have been about body cameras as well. And I just want to hopefully reaffirm, Mr. Mayor, through you or through our new administrator, Kirsten Stevenson, and through you, Chief. I see there on the 4th point, we have on our OBL, body-worn camera report, due this 4th quarter of this year. I think especially in light of the heightened awareness that's come from the U.S., just wondering that we're still on course, Chief, for a report later this year. Through you, Mr. Mayor, and those are my questions.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, and again through you, Chair. One of the things obviously we did in light of the advancing positions on this is we do have a report for fundamental costings. What we can't get into specifically is, and I'll tell you why later, is storage of that material, how it will work. So we do in fact have those figures. I can certainly do that at a later date. We have, since inception, looked at the literature. I know that in talking to many police leaders across the province, they have not done the same kind of academic research that we have for the number of years that we have. We have closely monitored the Canadian situation, specifically in Toronto, Calgary, Edmonton, both in terms of the equipment, its durability, battery life, the freedom of information issues, the policies, all those things. What I would say, certainly from my position, it's up to the board. We have just recently, the province has undertaken to do our digital evidence management systems and provide funding for that. Why that's important is it's going to be a consistent system across the province. I would recommend, as a police chief, that we do the same with body-worn cameras because, of course, they're integrally involved in terms of you capture the material, then you have to store it and manage it. If, in fact, it is hand-in-hand and funded by the province, particularly whether that happens, I know the Prime Minister has advocated for them. The Premier, I have not heard his position. But if they, in fact, decide to implement, my view would be whether it's equipment, policy, freedom of information issues, policies, practices. My view would be if you're going to do it, be consistent across the province so you don't have jurisdictional differences. And hopefully that the funding for that equipment would be provided at the provincial level. You get scales of economy through a tender at that level, which we just saw with DEMS. And once again, we really appreciate the Solicitor General doing that. So that would be my position. And I do, in fact, later we'll have costs for you.
Chief, thank you as always. You give such thorough answers. So again, being on our OBL, stating hopefully Q4 of this year, no later than that, we hope to hear back from you some form of formal report recommendations. I just want to get that on the community record. That's all.
Okay, so I was going to raise this under new business. So
I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor. Okay.
No. I was asked the chief if it's given the current context and the heightened awareness around these issues, that can we advance that to the third quarter rather than the fourth quarter, and let's get at it sooner rather than later. I think it's going to have it's going to be a pressure point for sure, and certainly we need the province to, as you say, Chief, look at. If we're going to go down that road, that it be somewhat unified and that there's certainly, better purchasing power collectively if there's a kind of a unified approach across the province. So, Chief, can we advance that to the third quarter? Is that a reasonable request? It's been on the OBL for quite some time, actually.
Certainly, and as you know, we've done it on an annual basis to this date. So I do know that both Superintendent Mike Worcester and Sergeant Scott Moore, and Scott Moore is our academician. He looks at the research, sees what's happening, stays in touch with the counterparts, can certainly move it up to third quarter for you. And in fact, as I say, we could give you some preliminary costings today, as you know, and I know there's commentary. The board's difficulty, I'll say, is the cost involved, not with the equipment, but in the administration and storage of all that has been a prohibitive point to date. We do know that officers support its use, and I would certainly support its use.
Okay, Chief. So the question was, can we advance it to the third quarter?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So why don't we provide that direction, Councillor Jackson, to request that the service bring a report on body-worn cameras into the third quarter of this year. Moved by yourself, seconded by? Fred? Thank you. All in favor? Brilliant. Thank you very much. Councillor Jackson, any more questions?
No. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Okay. Any other comments or questions on any consent items? Councillor Collins, go ahead.
Thanks, Mayor. I wanted to address 44G, which is the traffic report. And as was referenced earlier, contained in the report is the summary that we received earlier in the year as it relates to the Red Hill Valley Parkway enforcement, which was, I think on all accounts, it was tremendously successful as it relates to the goals and objectives that we had at the beginning of the program, and then the results that were provided to us afterwards as it relates to all of the infractions and issues that were dealt with as part of that pilot program, if you want to call it that. So I'm on Red Hill in the link on a daily basis, sometimes 2 or 3 times because of where I live and my proximity to the parkway. And during the program, obviously, it was constant enforcement of that stretch. And whether you were on Green Hill, King, or in that vicinity there was seemed to be always an officer there enforcing the speed and other issues at that location. Since the program has ended, obviously we've seen less enforcement. And the questions that I get to my office from residents and questions that I would have as someone who lives in the area and uses that area is what level of enforcement can we anticipate seeing in the short, medium, and long term? And I know that as part of our budget process, we had, we had invested into traffic and safety related enforcement activities in the service, and we were creating new positions in a phased approach. So the question I would have is, what are our plans from an operational perspective as it relates to enforcement on both Red Hill and the Link? And will we see some kind of a change once we fully implemented the traffic enhancements that we passed through the last budget process?
Thank you. Chief?
Thank you, and I'll turn it over to, actually both have a role in it. Deputy Bergen was obviously the creator through you, Councillor, for this initiative, and Deputy Diodati has the responsibility for creating the new traffic unit when it arrives. So I will toss it up between them as to who would like to speak first.
I see Deputy Bergen frantically waving his hand. We'll start with Frank, and then we'll go to Ryan. Thank you. Deputy Bergen?
Thank you. I am actually going to defer a new list wave to
So somehow we're not hearing your voice as clearly as we should. Is your microphone directed properly? There we go.
Thank you. Is that better? I will defer initially to Deputy Diodati and transfer over.
Okay. Deputy Diodati?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. Just in terms of the initiative, as Councillor Collins spoke about, it was very successful. Moving forward now, we've exhausted the monies that were earmarked for that initiative. So currently, as it sits now, our traffic unit, through our support branch, is continuing to do enforcement on the Red Hill and the Link. Most recently, we just completed our project Recalibrate, where the focus was stunt driving. A number of the offenses were issued on the Red Hill. And enforcement also continues through Division 3 and Division 2 through their DSOs and their patrol officers. We currently have a business plan for our traffic unit moving forward. Again, that traffic unit will be dedicated not only for the Red Hill and the Link, but for the city. Sorry, I believe Deputy Bergen is not muted right now.
He is now.
I think he is now, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, did you get my last point there? Just in terms of the dedicated traffic unit will be for the whole city. Again, a focus will be on the Red Hill and the Link. So we're continuing to work towards that, and we're hoping by September we will be up and running with the traffic unit.
Great, perfect to hear. Thank you very much for that.
Great, thank you.
Mayor, just a subsequent question to that, and the whole issue of stunt racing and modified vehicles and the noise associated, which those complaints are certainly on the rise from a trending perspective. And I know that Councillor Jackson has picked up the torch on that issue and taken a keen interest in helping us combat those issues. I'm just wondering, we had our recent blitz, and we still continue to get complaints. I have a hotspot that we're now dealing with on Queenston Road as it relates to vehicles participating in these illegal activities on Queenston, on Nash, around commercial properties, and the commercial operator has contacted us for assistance. So I'm just wondering again, we had an enhanced level of service related to trying to get at these issues, and can I get some understanding in terms of the good work Councillor Jackson's doing, as well as the heightened level of traffic enforcement that we'll see with those new positions, as to what we can expect with those issues. I know they're up specifically during the pandemic, but I think even before the pandemic, many of us were receiving calls for service related to specifically stunt driving, modified vehicles, and the noise that's created from those same vehicles.
Okay, thank you. Who wants to field that one? I'm going to toss it up between Ryan or Frank.
I can do a preliminary on it, okay, if you don't mind. And I have had conversations with Councillor Jackson. The noise, smoke, bells and horns, that is around mufflers. So just very quickly, no person should use a muffler. Cut out, straight exhaust, gutted muffler, Hollywood muffler, bypass, or similar. So there is in fact no bylaw, and we had a chat about this. it is in fact the Highway Traffic Act that provides for that offense. So I think our discussion, and I don't want to speak for your counselor, but I think you had some ideas around that. Other than that, before the stunt driving, and particularly on Queenston Road, and we've had that through the course of time as a problem standing, because it's basically a straightaway with 4 lanes. I will turn that back over to either Deputy Bergen, if he's got his mic working, first through the operational side of the house.
Thank you, Chief.
Deputy Bergen. Can't hear you. Sorry.
Thank you. Does that work better?
Yes, that works much better.
So I'll stop pushing the button that I thought I needed to stop pushing. Everything the chief said is absolutely bang on, and the reality is stunt driving is up, certainly during this COVID time, and the time frame is from the 17th of March until the 4th of June, and stunt driving is up 195%. So we are absolutely concentrating on that, as articulated in the report and the summary from Deputy Diodati with regards to Project Recalibrate. That has been our focus, as well as even in Station 20 in the Stony Creek region, they in fact have a POP project that speaks specifically to deal with that issue with regards to excessive noise from mufflers.
Super. Thanks for that, and I can only thank the chief and the deputy chiefs for their involvement on the issue and the heightened level of service that these issues are receiving. And I know my constituents welcome it, and I'm just hoping that heightened level of service on those issues is around for a while to come. That's all. So thank you for that. Appreciate that.
Thank you. How many tickets did we issue on the Recalibrate breaker, right? I recall some 800.
Yes, we're just over 800 in that period of time.
Yeah. And so the work continues. There's more traffic on the road these days, so things seems to have changed somewhat, but it needs attention ongoing for sure. Additional comments or questions on any of these items that we're potentially about to approve? Councillor Jackson.
Mr. Mayor, only piggybacking on what Councillor Collins said about the excessive exhaust noise, and I do appreciate, I had a great conversation with Chief Gert recently. And again, my staff, they did research. What we learned was Halton did not have anything special in their bylaw. It's all under the Highway Traffic Act, as Mr. Mayor, you had indicated to me, but I needed to, if you will, confirm that for myself. And you were absolutely right. However, the chief and I discussed, as we did with the Lincoln Red Hill Valley Parkway last year and continuing this year, requesting of the chief to consider additional enforcement. I'll be bringing a motion, Mr. Mayor, in consultation with you and Councillor Collins, to City Council, hopefully get approval to have a further crackdown by Hamilton Police Service on excessive exhaust noise, especially on our main arteries, and have that forwarded to the Police Service Board, again, similar to what we did with speeding on Red Hill and the link. That should hopefully be over the next week or two. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you. See, no further comments. So we had a motion to approve the consent items, which includes all of the communications items. Moved by McVicker, seconded by Jordy Elms. All in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none, thank you. It was a wonderful picture of your thumb there, Councillor Jackson. Much appreciated. Got your fingerprint now.
Mayor, if I might, I have my hand up, but I don't think you can see me.
I did not see you.
I will be brief, but particularly in light of the dialogue that's going on relative to mental health, I do want to highlight 4.4I. I won't get into it in depth, but what I will say in our jurisdiction is we have moved to a model with a mobile crisis rapid response team I mentioned earlier, with a mental health nurse and an officer respond to those calls, unlike many jurisdictions. But also we have both the COAST program, which we've had for many, many years after the death of Zachary Antidormi, a very tragic circumstance. And the last piece is in this report, because this is a crisis response unit, our social navigator. And once again, what is being posited by many in the community is that we should move to areas where it is not enforcement. It helps people. And this board has been the leader, in my view, by making this social navigator permanent in our organization after we did a pilot. So it's threefold in terms of the crisis response unit, social navigator, which does not criminalize behavior, that looks at alternate dispositions through the community to get people assistance. Secondly, COAST, follow-up for mental health, where it is not life-threatening. And lastly, our mobile crisis rapid response team, where it is in fact a life-threatening situation, and we do have a mobile response in those situations that fundamentally look to communication with the person, de-escalation through communication, and de-escalation so that we do not in fact have tragic outcomes as best we can.
Leading edge programs for sure, Chief. Thank you for highlighting that, and we appreciate all that good work. I think it's very appropriate and certainly much appreciated. So no further items on the consent and information items. So we're going to go to the discussion agenda 51A. It is an extension application pursuant to Section 8317 of the Police Services Act, OIPRD complaint investigation regarding Constable Paul Manning, badge number 835. That the Hamilton Police Service Board has approved that this report in Appendix A be made public. We have a motion to approve. So, Kristen, you can help me with this one first, I should say. You've got two motions here. A motion to approve, I guess, a previous receiving of a processing motion.
So now we have to. Oh. Sorry about that. Through the chair, that original motion was heard in camera session. So now that we have this public, we have to receive. We have the motion to approve for processing, and then the new motion has to do with a decision that the board will have to make with regards to whether or not to approve the extension.
Great, thank you. So on the original to approve the motion that was in camera, can I have a motion on to that effect? Moved by Fred Bennick, seconded by Don McVicker. Thank you. All in favor? Thank you. And then on the new motion, and I'll read it for the benefit of those that are listening, that the Hamilton Police Service Board received for a decision the application for the extension of the 6-month time period for the service of a notice of hearing against Constable Paul Manning regarding allegations of misconduct under Part 5 of the Police Services Act as amended. And that the board acknowledged the direction issued by the OIPRD in its letter dated December 20th, 2019, requiring the service of a notice of hearing on Constable Manning if there was sufficient evidence to believe on reasonable grounds that misconduct occurred, and that this direction required the Hamilton Police Service to initiate an extension application process under 8317 of the Act. The board received and acknowledged the email dated March 4th, 2020 from the complainant, S. Marula, stating he was in support of the application, as well as email dated March 4th, 2020, Constable Manning requesting certain board members recuse themselves due to conflict, and that the board is satisfied that the delay in the investigation process was reasonable on the basis of the chronology and explanation set out in the extension application report dated February 14th, 2020. Lastly, that the board approves the extension of the 6-month time period for the service of a notice of hearing against Constable Paul Manning on the basis of all documentation received with respect to the issue. And so is there a motion to approve that recommendation? Moved by Fred Bennick, seconded by Jordy Elms. Thank you, Jordy. Any comments or questions? If not, all in favor? Carried. Any opposed? Seeing none, that was unanimous. Thank you very much. Item 5.2 is the dedicated citywide traffic enforcement unit and school bus environmental enforcement cameras. There's a motion on that as well. That motion I'll read as well, just so it's clear. That the board approved correspondence from Chief Eric dated March 24th, 2020 with respect to item 5, the Public Works Committee report of 2020-022 City of Hamilton Vision Zero Action Plan update, and that the board approved the correspondence be forwarded to the City of Hamilton to the attention of Legislative Coordinator Alicia Davenport and copied to General Manager Dan McKinnon and Administrative Coordinator Nancy Winteridge. Any comments or questions on it? If not, a motion to approve that. Moved by Pat. Thank you. Pat Mandy, seconded by Councillor Jackson. All in favor then? Any opposed? Seeing none. Thank you. Item 5.3, Hamilton Accident Support Services Limit Collision Reporting Center 5-year agreement. The Hamilton Police Service Board entered into an agreement with Hamilton Accident Support Services Limited by which HASSL will provide collision reporting services to the Hamilton Police Service as defined in the said agreement for a 5-year period commencing on July 1st, 2020 and ending June 30th, 2025, and that the chair and administrator of the board be authorized and directed to enter into an agreement in a form satisfactory to legal counsel. Any comments or questions on it? If not, then a motion to approve. Moved by Don. Question on that, Don, or approve? Okay, thank you. And seconder? Pat, thank you. Any comments or questions? All in favor? No, you want to speak to that, Pat? Thank you. I see waving. Could you unmute Pat for me? Thank you. Go ahead, Pat.
To me, like we're going to go down to 2 centers instead of 3. And I'm just wondering what the community reaction will be to that. I can understand the situation downtown with the parking and so on, but I just thought, well, next time somebody hits my car, now I've got to go further. So I'm just wondering, will there have to be some kind of a communication message, whatever, and how will we manage some of that public concern?
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you. And I was going to raise that. Thank you, Member Manny, because we have looked at this for a number of years in terms of both the material deposited on the roadway in front of our station, the congestion, as you've noted. I'll say it's an unsafe situation in many cases where you have a tow truck on one side of King William, the parking on the other for those cars involved in accidents. And we have looked at, in terms of moving to the other 2 stations, which have much larger parking lots and facilities to handle this. So really, support services did do a review of that, looked at the number of accidents, and we've had some changes recently with COVID in terms of people reporting to stations. So this was an opportunity to test it out and see how it works using it at the other stations. And in large parts, we have not received any complaints, and we believe that it should be moving forward. The other change is we will be getting analytics, which is called CROMS, Collision Occurrence Management System, as part of this renegotiation, as I understand it, without additional costs. So we have been in the collision reporting center business, probably one of the first in the province. This is really just the evolution, and we believe between Division 2 and 3, it will be better service, both for the members of the public, because quite often they get out of their cars and they're standing in the roadway. It's a safety issue. As I say, there's oil, and because, of course, the vehicles are involved in collisions, oil and antifreeze, it becomes somewhat hazardous. So we just want to eliminate some of those risks.
Thank you. Pat?
That's it. Thank you.
So for the benefit of folks that are listening, Chief, just identify the 2 locations that are now going to be reporting centers.
Mike? Nope. Yes, thank you. I think I'm on. I'm having a little bit of battle. Yes, so it'll be Division 2, which is on Rymel Road, between Upper Wentworth and Upper Wellington. I'm sorry, that's Division 3. And Division 2, which is on King Street. I don't have the address off the top of my head, just west of Highway 20, or Centennial Parkway. So those 2 addresses will be, in fact, locations, and we will do, if this is approved, the information of the public about that change.
Okay, thank you. Any further comments on that, then? If not, a motion to approve. Moved by. Thank you. Seconded by Councillor Jackson. All in favor? Carried. Thank you. Year-end surplus allocation plan. So the Hamilton Police Service Board approved the allocation plan for the 2019 operating budget, favorable variance of 1.425.221 million. Any comments or questions on that? Councillor Jackson, go ahead.
So, Mr. Mayor, just to reiterate, because I know there was discussion about an hour ago, I think Councillor Collins raised it. So I see under page 5 of 5 of this report, police tax stabilization reserve of 409,000 would be remaining from the 1.4 million based on dissemination that the chief is recommending. COVID 332,000. Will that be possibly coming off the 409 remaining here, or did I misunderstand that about an hour ago when Anna Fleece brought a report on COVID costs? Mr. Mayor, through you, please.
Thank you. Anna?
Sorry, Chief. Yeah, I will answer that. And I do have another couple of comments because I understand from Councillor Collins' view of this earlier, whether he wanted to table this and take it back. What I can state again is item 1, the Pride review. The board already directed that the costs would come from there. The vehicle reserve replenishment as well, which makes up about half. We do have moving costs, the carbines, the survey for the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, and that really meets one of the recommendations, not all of it. The preliminary recommendations coming out of Mr. Bergman's report, it in fact included this almost 2 months ago in terms of consideration. So I think if we're going to look at these items or table it, I would just need to know what the will of the board is before we get into kind of all the specifics on this report. But to answer the question, police tax stabilization with the $409,000 remaining, that would in fact go to an account that the board could direct be used for COVID or other purposes.
Thank you, Chief. Mr. Mayor, I don't know if this discussion is going to continue, but that was the specific answer I was looking for. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
I didn't get any sense of tabling. I think there's just a desire to understand where the reserve might go and what it might be applied to in the future. And there is, Chief, just to follow on, is there an application process for police services to apply to the provincial government for additional COVID-related costs?
And thank you for the question, Mayor. Like you, I'm waiting for that amidst all chiefs bulletins that have been coming out. I have asked my counterparts. Nobody has seen anything to date. We do know that both the province and the federal government have mentioned about funding for those costs, but I've not seen anything specific to date. I look forward to it, and we are certainly prepared to defend our costs related to COVID and tracking them quite closely.
But there's no, I mean, that you're aware of that there's a separate process from the municipal process. So we're doing a kind of a broad advocacy on kind of collective resources. I'm not sure that it necessarily includes police, but it certainly would. But you're not aware of a separate process where there's advocacy going on in terms of the police cost.
I am not, but I do know that the Solicitor General's in trying to obtain personal protective equipment for us, which is surgical masks. But of course, we've got disinfectant, cleaning, cruisers, N95 masks, all that. So they have mentioned it, but I've not seen anything to date in terms of specifics.
Add that to our advocacy work collectively. I think that would be appropriate. Okay, you're at surplus allocation plan. I see no further comments. Mover and seconder on that. Councillor Jackson, second by Councillor Collins. All in favor? Carried. Thank you very much. Police Station 40, Waterdown. A motion to approve the Hamilton Police Service Board approve the construction of a new Police Station 40 in partnership with the Hamilton Fire Department for a combined police and fire facility, and that the board requests the City of Hamilton confirm and include the construction of a new Police Station 40 as part of and in partnership with the Hamilton Fire Department approved Waterdown Fire Station in the 2021 capital budget, and that the funding of the police portion of the proposed combined facility, estimated to be $8 million, be funded from the city's police development charge reserve, and that the Hamilton Police Service review and analyze the annual operating budget impact for Station 40 and report back to the board for review and approval. That motion is on the floor. Is there a mover for that? Moved by Collins, seconder by McVicker. Any comments or questions? Councillor Jackson.
Mr. Mayor, thanks. Chief, I just think for public consumption, before the board deliberates on this, and I am supportive, I think, Chief, maybe just a quick recap. The Mountain Station at Turner Park, if memory serves me right, on my first sojourn on the board, was open around 2002, 2003. And we got away from, if you will, the community policing centers, the CPCs, what I would call those satellite branches that we had scattered throughout our big city. And when we got away from that, the big station at Turner Park, Division 3, was opened up, like I said, about 18 years ago. And I think maybe, Chief, you just need to speak to the explosive growth that we're experiencing in our city, primarily in the Flamborough, Upper Dundas, Ancaster area, and the need after almost 20 years of opening the last new station and getting rid of the CPCs, the satellite branches, why this is germane moving forward over the next 5 to 10 years. Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Through you, please.
Thank you. Chief?
Thank you, Mayor. I'm only going to do some preliminary comments, and I will turn it over to our CAO, Anna Police, who has done the lion's share of this work, and I'll say in very short order. As you know, there was a place marker put in terms of capital expenses through Chief DeCare some time ago at a cost really that mirrors probably the cost of most buildings of a certain size. That was $25 million. This is in fact an $8 million investment, so a substantial reduction. We are working in partnership with Hamilton Fire. We are taking the opportunity, both the land acquisition, but the opportunities to share HVAC equipment, other facilities that reduces costs, much like we did at the Multi-Agency Training Academy. And the last piece to your point, and you hit it right, nail on the head there, Station 3 was originally placed near Elfrida because of the growth then. Currently, both Elfrida and Flamborough continue to expand, particularly Waterdown. And we have heard from Councillor Partridge many times about this. And this is to look after that at almost a third of the cost in a timely manner, particularly with the bypass going in. So we just thought it was a tremendous opportunity to really reduce costs. The last piece I'll say, and I do tip my hat to former Chief DeCare, who did quite a bit of work on developmental charges. And I'm sure that Councillor Ferguson, who used to say, I don't want any impact to the operating budget, the cost for that building will be through developmental charges. So thankfully for me, or my successor, they will not be faced with getting money from the operating costs for this particular venture. So, and I'm sure I stole thunder there, Anna, but over to you, our CAO.
Thank you, Chief.
Anna, please.
Thank you, Chief. The Chief covered a lot of it, but in the recent months, we've been speaking very closely with Chief Cunliffe over at Fire to see if we could manage a joint building in Waterdown for the community. And with the support of the deputies, we went out to Niagara Region to visit some substations. So it won't be a full police station. It'll be about 9,000 square feet, but we will be able to deploy resources from there, and it will be during business hours that the community can stop in. Absolutely efficiencies in terms of sharing land, sharing building, and a substation at the cost of approximately $8 million versus the originally forecasted $25 billion. So I think it's a great news story for Waterdown and a good collaboration project with Fire.
Well done, CAO Police. And similarly, back to Turner Park, as you know, Mr. Mayor, partnerships all over the place that were helped with the efficiencies as well. The library, the Y skateboard park, and the city baseball diamond. It's made for a wonderful multi-use complex, as it does at Nebo and Stone Church with the multi-use training center as well. So good work on this partnership to come in at 1/3 of the original cost. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments on it? If not, I did say a motion earlier. I think Councillor Collins, you moved it, and Councillor Jackson, I think, seconded it. Okay, all in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none, thank you. We'll turn to new businesses. At this point, we had on the agenda Member McVicker and the Ontario Association of Police Services Board's annual meeting. Don was nominated, I'll let Don speak to that, nominated and confirmed as a director of the Ontario Association of Police Services Board. So Don, congratulations, and do you have anything to add?
Thank you, Chair. I find that going to the two meetings now with the Ontario Association Board, it's there's a lot of good information that is provided on their website, and there's an extra a password that you can get into the membership, and we have that provided through Lois and now through Kirsten. But there's a lot of good detail in there of policy and procedures, but mostly it's communicating with the other police services boards across the province and seeing what their issues are, understanding them, and seeing if there's a common thread, and then bringing that information to Hamilton and seeing if we do have any issues that we can go to this board and ask them to help support any initiatives going forward. So a good communication tool, but a good learning tool also for everybody involved.
Great. Well, congratulations. We're glad you're there, and I'm sure you'll bring back the occasional report on similar issues and synergies that we can either learn from or we can advance to them in terms of their learning. So, next up, thank you. Congratulations. I'm going to turn to Councillor Collins. You had indicated a added item on defunding police. Councillor Collins.
Thanks, Mayor. And if I could start just by reading the motion. And I believe that Jordy may have had a suggestion for some modification. So if any member wants to amend the recommendation, I'm certainly open to those suggestions. And it reads as whereas members, moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Jackson, that whereas members of Hamilton City Council and members of Hamilton Police Services Board have received correspondence requesting the defunding of the Hamilton Police Service with an up to 20% reduction in their annual operating budget, estimated to be $34,296,000. And whereas the same correspondence requests the reinvestment of the proposed budget reduction into other city-funded services, i.e. food security, racism, and affordable housing, and whereas a budget reduction of 20% would substantially alter the current services provided by Hamilton Police Service staff, therefore be it resolved that the Hamilton Police Service staff present a report to the Hamilton Police Services Board detailing the service implications of an up to 20% operating budget reduction. So I just want to clarify some things. I did receive a couple of emails this morning from people asking why the board was contemplating a cut to the budget. We are not. To put it into context, we have received, I know at council, and included in the correspondence here today, probably 40, 50, I haven't counted, and they continue to come in this morning and through this afternoon as we're holding our meeting here. Requests from individuals and organizations that have participated recently in peaceful protests here in our city and elsewhere. There's a form letter that I think that we've all received, and some have added their own individual requests on top of the demands, and they are demands. And the theme of the petition is defund the police. And some have gone so far as to suggest that we need to abolish the Hamilton Police Service. I don't even want to get into that debate because I think it's nonsensical. I understand that those discussions are happening not just here in Hamilton, but all over North America. I think the concept in that regard is just one that is not even on the table for discussion. So, and to put it into context, it's not uncommon for us, whether at council or Hamilton Police Service Board, to receive feedback related to budgets, services, or both. But what surprised me with the demands included in the petition is the extent to which people would like to see services reduced related to public safety. And the message is completely contrary to what I'm hearing from the vast majority of my own constituents. My residents want more policing, not less. They want to see police patrolling their neighborhoods, monitoring our streets as much as possible. I referenced earlier today the commercial requests that I had in terms of businesses who are requesting the same kind of support. And I can say that Lucy and I, my assistant, deal with police service calls, if not on a daily basis, we're probably looking at 3 to 4 times a week. And so it is a constant service request that I get from my constituents. And the theme is that they would like to see more police in our community, and they would like to see more visibility. So it was very surprising to me to see a campaign that whose goals are quite the opposite. And defund the police to me means less resources for police, which will ultimately lead to less police officers. And it's become quite obvious that the defund the police campaign, whether it's here or elsewhere, is an attempt essentially to neuter the police. And that's my own opinion. And it's my own opinion that providing less resources for the police prevents or prohibits them from doing their job properly, and I believe ultimately leads to reduced public safety, as well as reduced safety for our officers if they do not have adequate resources in responding to calls. So what spurred the motion before us here today is that there's actually a motion in front of the City of Toronto looking at a 10% budget reduction, of all places, Toronto, where an elected official has suggested that they look at reducing their budget by 10%. And what was shocking about that motion, and I almost immediately called the deputy chief. I know that the chief had a very busy days in the last couple of days dealing with other matters. Is that what's shocking to me is that those kinds of actions could happen here tomorrow. And it's shocking to me that it's been brought forward as a political motion. It's certainly within the realm of possibility that, and it's within the process that allows that to happen. As a parent, I'm shocked to see that our school boards are entertaining the whole notion of not having police officers attend schools to assist teachers and students who may need police assistance. And we're on the verge of really starting our budget process through the summer and into the fall months. And I'm certain that the Defund the Police campaign will be in front of our board at some point, talking about and asking for some of the demands that are included in the petition. And I, in fairness, I should send that. I didn't see a copy today in our agenda, as it's been written and sent to essentially all of City Council. I think in fairness to our citizen members, they should have a copy of that. And so I will distribute that at the appropriate time as soon as we're done our meeting today. And I should have done that earlier. So I'm certain that the demands will be in front of us as a board in terms of asking us to entertain a reduction in the police budget. I'm certain that it will most likely be in front of City Council to look at doing the same. And I believe that those who submitted the petition need to understand that in defunding the police, whether it's 5%, 10%, or up to 20%, there will be implications and there will be service reductions in the community. And so I think we need to make informed decisions. I think those people who are advocating for those reductions need to know the consequences of what they're asking for. And I think it's incumbent upon us as a board and certainly as City Council to ensure that everyone has the same information in front of them when we receive these requests. I also think that, as is the case in Toronto, that we could see some kind of a political motion here. I haven't heard from my colleagues yet, but it's quite possible that, if someone's flirting with the idea of whether it's 10% or otherwise, they need to know as well politically what the implications are from a service reduction. On the upside, in terms of these conversations, and as I've said publicly to the media and to my own constituents, I'm all for talking about and having a conversation about the social problems that our municipality faces as it relates to housing, as it relates to shelters for homeless, our population, as it relates to services for seniors, there's a whole list of demands there in terms of social problems that need to be addressed. And our council has had those discussions, and it's been near unanimous support for, if I use housing as an example, we're doing more here in Hamilton than most other municipalities in Ontario and probably Canada. And we've taken on that file on our own without a lot of support from either the provincial or federal governments. Shelter and homeless population, we currently have a subcommittee set up where we're looking at women's shelter services and how we can enhance those, and we're dealing with those who are in the industry of providing those services and other social programs. And so those conversations always happen, and I think it's important for us as a city council, wearing my council hat, to be open to suggestions to enhancing those services and solving those problems. I don't believe that we're going to solve our social problems either here in Hamilton or across the country by doing it at the expense of our police service. We're not going to solve our affordable housing problems at the expense of police. We're not going to solve our homeless or shelter problems at the expense of the police budget. And we're not going to solve other social problems at the extent of the police budget. So I thought to be proactive with a motion here, hopefully the chief and deputy chiefs can come back with some information. And I think it's a range that we need to look at because I'm not certain what's going to be requested. I know that this conversation will continue through the summer and into the fall. And I think we need to have the information in front of us so that when the request is made, and they will come, we're going to have information in front of us to illustrate to the community that in fact there will be severe consequences. And I know that less of a budget means less services on the street. It means less officers. It means less of the good things that were referenced earlier here in the agenda when the chief talked about the social navigator program, talked about our COAST program, talked about our mobile rapid response unit. And so, those are the things that we've invested in. And if someone's contemplating taking resources away, those are the types of programs that will be at risk. So that's not for me, though, to illustrate to the board or to the community. I think it's incumbent that we get that information from the chief. And I'm certainly up for the conversation about people who want to reduce the police budget, but I'm not hearing that from my constituents, and that's certainly something that's very unique. And had you said to me, geez, even last year at this time, that we'd be contemplating today a scenario where people are talking about 20% reductions in community safety, or not having police in our schools, or just not having police in general, I would have bet you a lot of money that I didn't have. And but that's where we're at right now. There's just a lot of crazy things going on in the world in general, beyond the pandemic. And I understand that there are all kinds of social issues that we need to address. I just don't think they should come at the expense of the police. That's my own personal opinion. But I think this motion will help in responding to the messages that we've received as a board and as a council. And I think it's incumbent upon us to share that information with people when they're asking for reductions. That's my motion, Mr. Mayor. It is seconded by Councillor Jackson. And as mentioned, I'm open to revisions, and I don't want to be firm on the 20%. As I mentioned, I'm hoping the chief, if this is approved today, can come back with some options, because even a 0%, even a freeze on the police budget has implications as it relates to our labor force and the services that we provide. So,
okay. Good. Well expressed motion, Craig. Well expressed for sure. I'm going to turn to Jordy. You mentioned Jordy earlier on. It's a positive amendment. Let us turn you on there. There you go.
Hello, am I on?
Yes, you are.
I don't think I need to have an amendment. My point was one of context. I agree totally with it. Is that what we're hoping to get back from the chief and the senior staff is not as if we were back in a budget process again for them. We want metrics that give us clear indicators of the cost of certain paths. Not a traditional, well, what if you were asked to cut 10%? So, and I have no doubt that the chief and the deputies and Anna can give us that. And we're not something that we're going to immediately run to the budget committee with. We just need the ammunition, and we need it. Time is probably of the essence. Nobody could have predicted the events of the past couple of weeks, and we're just going to have to deal with it. And they're going to have to deal with it against the context of the first thing we discussed today. It's going to be part of this as well. So I don't think it needs an amendment. I quite support it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jordy. Fred,
thank you. I'm okay with looking at budget options, and I'm okay with approving this for our information. But I'd also like to share some thoughts from a citizen service side. And I want to thank all those, I don't know how many letters or emails we got, but I want to thank them for the communications of sending. It takes time and effort, and it is appreciated by us. But I'd like to speak to this issue as it relates to the Community Safety and Wellbeing Plan, Bill 175, named the Safer Ontario Act. So some of us heard from the Solicitor General, Sylvia Jones, last year regarding this initiative. And as you know, the province has mandated that this be put in place in all municipalities in Ontario by January of 2021. And the mandate comes from the Ministry of Community Safety and Correctional Services. But part of this plan is a way by which to challenge institutional boundaries and organizational culture at a systemic level. I believe that this required plan is an avenue by which many social needs and marginalized groups' concerns can be addressed. The CSWB is wholly intended to address complex issues. It's intended to address poverty, homelessness, mental health, systemic racism, which are just a few items, but they fit into much of the correspondence that we have been receiving. And it's really, in my mind, a proactive way for us to get ahead of some of these issues. The required plan is to engage non-traditional groups in crime prevention efforts. It should also proactively identify and address local risk factors before they escalate. And in a nutshell, these areas are incident response, risk intervention, crime prevention, and social development. And as you know, I visited each of the frontline squads in each of the divisions several months ago. It was a way by which, as a board member, I could thank officers on our behalf for the work that they do and also allow them to speak openly to a board member about their joys and their concerns. And among other concerns, officers asked and are commented on why so much time of theirs was spent on non-policing calls. Many of these calls and activities are not expected of the police service in the PSA, the Police Services Act. And it seems to me that for a variety of reasons, but mostly diminished funding and staffing within our social service network, the police have become the default. The police have become the last resort for a phone call. The liability factor alone requires a response from our frontline officers to every single call. The list of non-policing chores is long, but now is not the time to get into that, and I'd be happy to share that long list. But as a society, I feel that we have become over-reliant on the police. I agree with the perspective that as a community, through the CSWB, we can and should reduce the scope of police responsibilities. When we have an issue in our community, we default to the police. Calls for service continue to increase each year. And no one would argue that the police should only do police work. But as a community, we must determine how and what that looks like. So let me share a little bit about regarding the CSWB and three main expected outcomes that could reduce the calls for service. Community mediation, conflict resolutions with neighbors, neighborhoods, marginalized groups and individuals and communities. Violence intervention programs, RNs and RPNs engaged and trained in domestic violence, medical issues, risk assessment, sexual assault, etc. And number three, engaging expertise of non-police in mental health areas, emergency response, prevention, and ongoing treatment. If we can't demonstrate that these can be done, then we can't diminish the funding because the police are currently doing it. It is up to all social agencies to determine whether we are able and willing and clearly demonstrate accomplishing these three chores without police assistance. The CSWB was clearly initially intended to have all social agency heads, that is, CEOs of hospitals, EMS head, police senior command, university presidents, leaders in marginalized communities, most senior people at City Hall, treatment center heads, etc., meeting all together and building a plan together. And I know this process is being worked on by our city staff, but I think we should back up a little bit. I would like us as a police board, trustees of the service, called to direct the organization to, as soon as possible, start meeting with citizens, start getting ourselves out in front of people and listen to them. Listen and engage them. The only way to diminish funding in policing is to diminish the calls for service. None of us are interested in making radical and quick decisions. But I trust that we are willing to listen, engage, and be part of a rational, program-based solution to deal with policing, to deal with police doing non-policing work. And if we do this well, and with all the social agencies held accountable to make this work, it has the ability to create a very special plan, and the plan that is owned by many in a very professional and productive way. So I suggest that we start by meeting face-to-face with those who want to speak to us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I can tell you that the Community Safety and Wellness Plan is being led by Paul Johnson through Emergency and Community Service, and has been extended. In fact, it's not due by the end of the year as a result of the COVID issue. So I believe it's extended by 6 months. So we're talking the middle of next year. So there's plenty of time to participate. And I do note, Fred and others, that there was some question as to whether or not I originally said a board member or a senior command, or both. And I wonder if a board member should not be engaged in participating in the ongoing dialogue there. I think that would be certainly helpful. Let me, I think it's important that obviously this issue is tied up with the tragic, horrific, hard to understand and comprehend, death and murder, one might say, of George Floyd in Minneapolis. I think we can all agree that that's just a horrendous behavior on a policeman's part to end a life so callously and so. I can't even put words to it. Quite frankly, I think it's outrageous. Given all of that, we also have to acknowledge that this is wrapped up in systemic racism. Whether I think we need to accept the fact that racism exists, not just in the United States, but in Canada for sure. And the reality is that we have much more to do to kind of work through that. I'm not sure that the anger that's being now displayed to all police is the right approach. There certainly is